We are on YouTube now. Welcome everybody to session number 3 of the Responsible Raw Materials Conference for this year. This is our 5th Responsible Raw Materials Conference because it's the highlight of our year. We love doing things like this. For those of you who have been following us since 2020, when we were all in the depths of COVID, and actually, yes, I was living in this office at that precise moment in time. So it's quite nice to be back here again. Back in 2020, Rose Clark and myself, we set up Responsible Raw Materials because we thought, hang on a second, what do we actually mean by responsible raw materials? If you want to find out what the answers were, then go to the website, click on the talks or click on past events, and you'll be able to find out what our answers were. We then trucked forwards through time, and 12 months later, we set up our second conference, which was, okay, so we think that doing these things with raw materials in a responsible manner is really important, but how on earth do we do it? And so our second conference was called the ESG Toolbox, and through that conference we shared loads and loads of hints and tips and case studies as to how we can make sure we do all of this in a responsible way. Forwards to year 3, and that's where we started talking about the just transition and what was the role, or what is the role, or should the role be, of raw materials in unlocking that just transition. And again, loads of fantastic talks about, well, what do we actually mean by a just transition? How does this vary from sector to sector, different geographies? What can this need for change actually bring to different parts of the world? And I think we came to a conclusion that it was all really very exciting, which was pretty awesome. Into our 4th conference, which was the one that we held last year in 2023. And the topic of conversation was trust. And we kind of like to think that we were maybe a bit of a trendsetter, because every conference that I went to after in last year had a session, or its entire theme was about trust, which was glorious because we'd done lots of homework on that, because last year we had at least 70 different talks from different people around the world sharing with us what they felt trust meant within the raw materials sector, be that trust as perceived from mining companies or governments or civil society, communities, you name it, investors. What does this actually mean? And this, of course, takes us through to this year's conference, which is the topic, or the name of the topic for this year's conference is Critical Choices, Risk in the Eye of the Beholder. And we've already had some fantastic talks over the course of the last day or so. And I'm just going to share my screen so you can see where all of this information comes from. So this is the landing page for this year's conference, Critical Choices. If any of your friends or families want to register, we'll just go and click on the button. You've all managed to do it, which is fantastic. We're also streaming live to YouTube, so if you prefer to use that as your mode of engagement, then feel free to do that as well. That is very, very welcome to engage with us in any manner you see fit. Now, what you can see further down the page is a little infographic that we have put together, and this is meant to depict making, or some of the different choices that we might have to make as individuals who have got something to do with the raw materials sector, or at least are very interested in it. And of course, this includes everything from being cognizant of our planetary boundaries. So actually, what are some of the things that we cannot change, perhaps, in the world in which we live? But then also, of course, there's different aspects of things like resource nationalism, global trade, different forms of technology that can be brought to the fore, such as artificial intelligence. What does all of this mean? What about our circular economy or circularity? What do we want to think of with regards to that? How about different forms of finance? What sort of different models do we need to be considering when we're thinking about raw materials? Now, if I scoot down to the bottom of the page that we have here, what we've got is the lineup for each of the sessions that we're going through this week. And you can see, because we're incredibly selfish with regards to wanting to hear from as many different people as possible, we've got 8 different sessions that we've pulled together. We're currently in Tuesday afternoon, and I'll introduce our wonderful speakers very, very shortly. But just in case you didn't dial in yesterday, so Monday afternoon UK time, we heard from some fantastic speakers, including Stephen Desposito, who talked us through some of the work that they're doing in regeneration. So looking at old mine sites and saying, well, what kind of value can be derived from them, not just financial value, but other forms of value as well. We heard from Dr. Doris, who gave us her rundown on designing sustainable prosperity, which I absolutely loved, because the vision that she was painting for us really was about viewing the earth as an integrated whole. So what are all those different ecosystems? What are all those different values that we can bring together there? And so therefore, what does that mean in terms of business models and value models that we can look at? Terry put on the table an awesome piece of kit called the Gold Catcher, which is a piece of kit that can be used by artisanal and small-scale miners. But he also brought a wealth of experience with regards to artisanal mining, which was absolutely fantastic. And then Jodie Ann took us through some of the background with regards to, okay, what do we mean by just transition, which was really, really lovely because it built on the conference we ran a couple of years ago. But then also as well, different forms of finance and what might be needed going forwards, or what were some of the different options going forwards with regards to finance. And finally, we had the gentleman who can only be described as the legend of anything that is quotable, and that is Andy Reynolds. And he really did inspire us. That's not just the name of his organization, as to how we can maybe not only realize that we might be constraining ourselves inside models, but how do we think outside those models? How do we seek that area of chaos and think, well, hang on a second, it's through that we might be able to get that step change into different forms of, say, doing exploration, or finding those materials and those metals that we need in order to be able to go through all of those step changes that are required by the world in the near future. So that was yesterday afternoon. And then this morning, we went back into that world of tailings facilities. There's a little bit of a running theme through the course of this week. And Anita gave us the most amazing rundown of what they've been up to in Australia. And if you want to go and see some fantastic maps of where some of those old mine sites are in Australia, but also where they've been collecting data that in the near term will be made freely available so that people can see, well, what else might be in those waste piles, for example, in those old mining assets, which is really exciting. We also then heard from Guillaume about the cobalt supply, both within the DRC, but also more than that, actually, what's the true impact with regards to artisanal mining, and really interesting case studies and stories from his perspective, which was absolutely great. We then took a deep dive into the world of geology. So for those of you who are not geologists, well done for sticking with us. Now, from a geological perspective, we didn't actually go that deep. Wow, could we have gone deeper in terms of the geekiness of those numbers, etc. But what we got from Jeff, Mark, and then to a certain extent from Victor as well, was really saying, okay, it's not just about understanding the rocks and acknowledging the fact that nobody really knows what's in the ground, to be honest. It's all just a guess until somebody goes down and gets it. But when we're trying to understand what might be in the ground, we need to roll in these modifying factors as well, or other factors that allow us to understand different aspects of sustainability, but also what are the market demands, what are the engineering technologies that are required in order to be able to dig those materials out of the ground. And then Victor then pulled us back from that world of geology into really thinking, okay, well, actually, if we are going to mine, how are we going to do it, especially in, say, a European perspective? Because, of course, within Europe, there's massive change going on at the moment, in part driven by big policies and acts that have been launched in the last year, but also, of course, that big need from a part of the world that is more focused on manufacturing and industry rather than digging those raw materials out of the ground. So how does Europe get hold of all of these materials that it, of course, needs? Then on to the OECD and Luis, and so he gave us a rundown as to the latest updates there, especially with regards to looking at governance, with regards to those critical raw materials, on into Mark Camilleri and looking at relationships between the EU and Canada and what those kind of partnerships can bring to the table. And then finally, the wonderful Hershey gave us a rundown on, well, actually, what do we mean by ethics and trust within the raw materials space? All of these talks are well worth a little look-see, absolutely fantastic. And every single one of them can be found. If I go and click on the talks button here, you'll be able to find every single one of those talks from today and yesterday already uploaded. So for example, if I click on Jodie Ann's area here, you can see her talk has been edited and uploaded onto the website already. Thank you very much to the team for doing that. So, having said all of that, that's what we've already done. Today, we have the most amazing lineup for you as well in session number 3. And our first speaker is the fabulous Diego. Now, Diego, if you, I know that we are sharing your slides for you, so we're going to bring you to the fore very, very shortly. Diego is going to be talking to us about sustainable resources management in the EU. Now, there's a little bit of a European focus this week. Don't worry. Most of what we're talking about is applicable everywhere, isn't it, Diego? And so what I'm going to do is Aileen is going to start sharing Diego's slides for him. I am also going to make sure that we spotlight Diego as well, which I will be able to find him at some point in time. I've gone and lost Diego, everybody. Where's Diego gone? There he is. Excellent. I'm going to spotlight Diego for everybody. And I'm going to invite everybody to please put your hands together for the fantastic Diego. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sarah, for this really entertaining introduction and breakdown over the past few days. And I hope that you can hear me well, by the way. Yep. My computer's, having a little bit of an issue, but I will begin my presentation now because I only have 10 minutes and this topic is quite comprehensive. And to admit that we're just beginning on the process, so a lot of questions still remain. But I want to highlight, maybe moving on to the next slide, about what we mean towards the Sustainable Resource Management Law. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the Global Resources Outlook 2024 predicts that global consumption of raw materials will increase in a business as usual scenario by 60% by 2060. This is really dangerous for the biosphere, for what we called, well, not only for humans, but also our ecosystems and how they're able to contain this level of exponential material consumption. On the right-hand side, you can see already that by 2020, effectively, anthropogenic mass, so human-made mass, was able to supersede already biomass in terms of tonnage. So we are increasingly exceeding the biocapacity of the Earth based on the materials that we consume. And this rise in material consumption is rising much higher, actually, than even population increase. Though population does have somewhat of an impact, the consumption is actually coming from much more affluent countries. Can you go to the next slide? And on the left-hand side, you can see what we mean. So basically in the EU, I'm using the EU because we're working on this topic at the European Environmental Bureau, and we're centered here in Brussels. And we see that the EU has an demanding type of resource consumption and production. On the left-hand side, despite all of the initiatives that we have made in terms of circular economy, resource efficiency, and all of these policies that are coming out, our material footprint, which really gives us a calculation, even though it's weight-based, still is a good proxy for our consumption, how our consumption is impacting the planet. And it's broken down into 4 categories: biomass, metal ores, non-metallic minerals, and fossil fuels. As you can see from the material footprint on the left-hand side, the only times that our material footprint effectively increased in Europe in a considerable amount was actually 2 ways. One of them was in the 2008 financial crisis, which was the biggest drop, and then over again in 2020, even though in 2020, of course, was caused by the COVID pandemic, but since then it has actually recuperated. So what this tells us is that despite the technological efficiencies that we have achieved over the past decades, despite much more analysis on resource management, we unfortunately do not have the data that our economies are becoming much more sustainable, right? From a materials perspective. On the right-hand side, you can see what I mean by this. Since 2000, the material consumption of Europe, EECA, or North America, in the case of North America and Europe, has decreased a little bit, so not substantially. And as I mentioned, the reasons why already, why that decrease happened. In other countries, I mean, in other regions, sorry, such as in Africa, they have only increased their material footprint by 1 ton since 2000. So there's, of course, a need to discuss what does resource management actually look like around the world when some countries are under consuming and other countries are over consuming. Next slide, please. We can see as well here that when it comes to consumption of the EU, despite the fact that we have a very high and double the sustainable limits of planetary boundaries, we actually see that in terms of the donut, which many participants are probably familiar with, this is some recent research, where actually many countries in the EU are not meeting the social distance index, so meaning that we're underachieving in a lot of these social indicators, and we're overachieving in terms of the ecological ceiling. So even though we're talking about a lot of consumption of raw materials on the material footprint category, we're actually not even meeting societal needs. So this consumption, in a sense, consumption and production, it's not necessarily leading to higher well-being metrics. So where do we do now? I mean, we have a lot of legislation on climate law. We have a lot of emphasis on sustainability, of course, but we're trying to work towards a more comprehensive outlook. Next slide, please. So this is what we mean by sustainable resource management within the EU. And this is the EEB working with a few other organizations, as you can see on the screen. And we have come out with a white paper that came out actually last month. In this white paper, next slide, please, we basically make the case that we need to escape the carbon tunnel vision. Yes, of course, climate action is absolutely necessary, and we are really meeting some concerning future developments, but this cannot be done solely on a carbon emissions lens. We need to also tie in raw materials. How do we build cities? How do we consume and produce? And how this impacts also countries in the global south, right? We can move on to the next slide. So then we're arguing for a directive at the moment, whether it is a legislation or directive. This is something that we're working with. But the main thing that we want to focus is on an actual binding reduction of the EU's material footprint from 14.8 tons per capita, which is the 2023 measures from Eurostat, to actually 5 tons per capita by 2050, with midterm targets and differentiated national targets as well, similar to what we have for carbon emissions. Of course, the targets of France, the targets of Germany will differ greatly in terms of the targets of Malta, targets of Lithuania, targets of Greece, for example. And this has to happen through a democratic argumentation. Next slide, please. So this, a lot of this work has actually been developed already by OVAM, who did a study, particularly on this topic. One of the things that they are arguing for as well is having an EU resources law, and then breaking it down into fair distribution of material resources, sector-specific roadmap. So like I mentioned before, creating sub-targets. So you have your national target, and you might have your regional target, you might have an urban target, and then also connecting these targets to industry or sector-specific targets that are able to be the ones that are the most resource intensive, and how do we reduce them, right? And this would have to align very well, of course, with the climate targets and circularity targets that are already ongoing. And then lastly, the main really important thing is that within our resource management law, we want to make sure that we see in stronger emphasis actually on a just transition. So how do workers can benefit from an economy that uses less materials? It's not just about reducing everything and hoping to meet planetary boundary measures. Yeah, it's about actually deciding democratically through deliberations, through climate assemblies, through policies about how do we actually achieve this reduction beyond, of course, just hoping that technology will fix it. So this will require a democratic process, and this will require, of course, strong citizens' involvement about how do we really get urban areas, countries as well, to come up with policies that are actually able to bring down the material footprint. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done. aware of the time. I only have 2 minutes. Okay, so then we make the case within our white paper, 7 main arguments, and you can see them on the screen. The idea is transition to a true circular economy. By that I mean a lot of the emphasis on the circular economy policies at the moment are, some of them are very promising. However, many of them still rely on waste management. What we want to do with this resource management law is how do we bring business initiatives in the market as well to move into that rethink, reduce type of waste hierarchy, where now we can create business models that, of course, dematerialize their business processes, of course. Another aspect of this is how does the EU create a strong new type of diplomacy, a resource diplomacy, let's say, that is different than the one that is pursuing right now, but rather one that promotes global peace and security. We do know that a lot of issues concerning by security, I mean planetary security, not necessarily security in the military means. So with this being said, is that a lot of the conflicts out there are related to resource access, right? Whether it is to sell oil to the international market or to sell conflict minerals to international market. And the reason why these are sold and these military ventures really go through is because there is a market for this demand, right? So in a sense, if the EU reduces its material footprint, it would therefore reduce its material intensity of this economy, therefore could develop a different alternative diplomatic model. And in an area where geopolitical conflicts are really becoming much more tenuous, the EU needs to have a different mechanism set in place so that it's not able to get stuck in between these conflicts now, but also in the future. And then maybe lastly, I will mention just really quickly the importance, of course, of fostering well-being and equity. And this ties to my future, my previous point. The reason why this is important is not resource management just in the technical level, as circular economy is being pursued at the moment, but within national strategies, the idea is to connect social policies to resource management. By this, I mean, how do social policies in terms of universal basic services, in terms of a shorter working week, how do these relate to reducing material consumption? And actually, how do we then create social policies that are actually targeted to well-being, decarbonization, and dematerialization altogether? And then maybe the last slide that I will show, the political will is there. There is already a mention of this within the 8th Environmental Action Program. There's already measures, of course, on particular product policies. Maybe just the last slide, because I'm running short on time. Yeah, and then we have also, sorry, the second to last. Yes, we have also countries that are first movers that are already doing this, such as Austria, the Netherlands, Flanders, and Finland, and Spain as well. However, these countries are first movers, so their ability to actually carry out this material footprint reduction will be limited because there's not a cohesive EU process at the moment. And these are not binding either. But if the EU were to move towards a binding resource use reduction target, we would see a different type of economy that would be good for business, good for the planet, good for global peace, and as well, good for the well-being of our citizens. So I'll cut it there just for the sake of time, and would be happy to answer questions.
Diego, thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. A round of applause, everybody, for the fantastic Diego. Brilliant. Diego, just with regards to this, and I know that there are a number of questions that have come in whilst you've been speaking through different forms, which is absolutely great. You were talking about planetary boundaries and different ways, I guess, in terms of how do you actually calculate those and what does that mean? Can you give us a really simple description of what do you actually mean by the planetary boundaries? Because there are some people here, for them, this might be the first time they're actually hearing this. And so therefore, understanding that concept as a whole, would you be able to give us a quick overview?
Yeah, sure. So the planetary boundaries is a framework that was developed by scientist Rockström. And this was came out in 2009, I believe. The idea was actually to connect this in a sense towards seeing the biocapacity of the Earth, focusing on climate change. They have 9 planetary boundaries. Water consumption, for example, so blue and green water. So also focusing on novel entities, so meaning microplastics, pollutants as well. And it's quite comprehensive. The idea is to see in a simplified model, of course, how is the planet able to sustain life within, in terms of our ability to impact the planet. And as of 2023, we unfortunately have already surpassed the 6th planetary boundary, right? We have now effective data and analysis since 2009 of how much our human activities actually impacting the planet. And I mentioned it's just on a planetary level. But if you actually reduce it into individual countries, you actually see that some countries are severely under consuming, and this begins while others are severely over consuming. So in a planet that is very limited in a sense, we only have so many forests, we only have so much capacity for the sea to capture our carbon. We only have so much water in our Earth, right? What this means is then it's a question of actually not necessarily growing the pie, the material pie, as I hope this presentation made the case for, but actually on how do we divide that material pie. So yes, that's I have a very simplistic version of planetary boundaries. Yes.
No, thank you for that, Diego. And how does the planetary boundary vision and concept, etc., how does that fit into things like circularity and the circular economy? How do those two concepts come together?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. On that sense, there is the consumption footprint, which is measured in the mentioned as well last year in the circular economy monitoring framework, and even before, I think it came out already in 2019. So that does take an LCA level method for consumption. But I think at the moment, there's still a lack of understanding how our consumption is impacting planetary boundaries still within products, for example. There's a big focus, like I mentioned earlier, on climate change. So a lot of the focus is actually on emissions, how are products impacting emissions, right? Which is, in a sense, easier to calculate. But the issue, what happens is how are products actually impacting water consumption? How are they impacting chemical pollution? How are they impacting at land use, right? And I feel like at the moment, there is still a lot of analysis still needs to be done on that end. And we're hoping that this EU resource management law would really harmonize this type of measures. And not to say that there isn't anything being done. I mean, absolutely there is. And I think ideally a product passport, for example, is a way of moving towards that further analysis of not just focusing on carbon emissions, but also focusing on other aspects of how our products are impacting our ecosystems. Yeah.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your presentation that there are a number of countries that are already, doing a really good job or progressing to that point where they're beginning to hit those targets, such as I think you mentioned Austria, Finland, Flanders, etc. What are they doing that the rest of us should perhaps be trying to emulate?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I think these countries have, first of all, accepted that that our economies are having a disproportionate burden on the planet, and also it's not necessarily leading to higher well-being. So I think these countries want to do something better than what the current proposals is, which is, like I mentioned earlier, my critique of circularity, not like we don't need it, but just that it's unexploited, to use that term, right? So these countries are using these planetary boundaries framework, of course. They're using this material reduction framework, but at the moment, it is non-binding, meaning that is a political statement, which is fair enough. I think that's where we should start. The idea is that by making this political statement, as such as in the case of Austria, 80% material footprint reduction, there's still a lot of discussion of, okay, well, how do we achieve this? But I think the political statement is enough to actually move businesses, move institutions, move everything else to actually achieve that. Whether it happens or not, that's to be debated. But I think these countries are much further behind, much further ahead than other countries, such as my own country, the United States, for example, that doesn't even recognize its material consumption as an issue, which is actually one of the world's highest. Same with Australia. And what is happening is that they're leaving their economies extremely vulnerable to a world where economic growth, for example, becomes severely stunted by climate change impacts, such as Bloomberg recently last week wrote an article about how climate change is already stunting economic growth. And this is what I'm saying. Like, in a sense, these countries are analyzing their economies. They're saying there is serious climate change impacts that are going to really affect our GDP. So therefore, we need a different model to make our economies much more resilient. And then obviously, you can argue, of course, relocalizing, reindustrializing, shorter supply chains, what have you, get the workers involved, the trade unions involved, of course, in this. But again, is a democratic at the first core, if I may say one last thing, is this is a democratic debate at the end of the day about how we reduce material consumption. It is not a top-down. There has to be bottom-up approaches as well.
Diego, thank you so much. An awesome start to session 3. Everybody, round of applause for the fabulous Diego. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Excellent. Our next speaker is the fantastic Kate Moore. So Kate, if you want to start sharing your slides now, is a good moment to do so. So Kate is based at Camborne School of Mines, so down in a very sunny part of the UK. And as we can see here, Kate is going to be bringing to us something to do with some risks with regards to small scale mining, because it, of course, sometimes requires very different types of technology, but also different types of business models as well. So with that, I'm going to invite everybody to please put your hands together for the fantastic Kate Moore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to Diego for setting up this talk very nicely, actually, in illustrating the exponentially increasing demand of raw materials that we're all subject to at the moment. This little scheme reinforces that if we look to the EU designations of criticality as they've gone through time, the more we've looked at the issues, the more problems we've identified and the more challenges. So we have a widening array of bulk and technology metals that are causing concern. And another little scheme, another infographic to show that interplay of global and local factors that actually impact access to raw materials. So this scheme looks at the production of coal, copper and lead, and antimony as a function of the onset of the Yugoslav wars in 1991, where essentially on this exponential graph, there were huge impacts, though graphically they don't appear very big, on coal, copper, lead production, and antimony production stopped completely as a critical raw material. And so that's where it couldn't withstand the local perturbations that impacted supply. But that was because it was on a backdrop of increasing production in China. And what we see prior to the mid-1980s is actually that antimony production was pretty well spread globally and actually within Europe as well. So there's a lot of material in the ground that we have access to regionally, but this combination of local and global challenges that impact manufacturing locations has resulted in a number of strategies. And of course, most countries have those strategies: US, Japan, China, Russia, Korea, everywhere. But the UK and the EU strategies and act are actually quite closely aligned, that we have to think about the supply chains, but that we have to think more clearly about what we have local access to in the case of supply chain perturbation. And so ultimately, we need to expand the geography of production, thinking about our international supply chains, but bringing mining closer to home as well. And if we're bringing mining closer to home, we have to think about what resources we actually have on our doorstep. And so the global solutions to access to raw materials are place-based. They're place-based in the international context, and they're place-based in the local context. But following on from some other talks that we've seen as well in the last 2 sessions of this meeting, there's ongoing work to enhance best practice to ensure that we can ramp up supply locally using those local resources. Obviously, that's to varying success depending on the jurisdiction in which mining is operating. And we heard a lot yesterday about how that relates to the competence of mining projects. And really, we need to think about when is enough enough? When is it economic enough? When does the geology that we have regionally fit the global economic paradigm of where things can be ramped up and brought online at a relatively low unit cost of production? And what doesn't happen? What happens when our geologies don't fit that economic global paradigm of producing the lowest cost raw material? So we need to think very carefully about how we reorient the global and the local. And that leads to some very interesting ideas about where we can access raw materials. And there's a different set of ambitions and a different set of ways of viewing risk, depending on whether people think beyond the global or whether people think local. And so there's the 2 classic examples of going global are that of deep sea mining and of production out of this world in space. And in some cases, we're seeing deep sea mining getting going already, though not in international waters. But the really important voices and narratives that are coming out now are that when you look at this from a mining perspective, the deep sea mining and the global extraterrestrial kind of beyond the fringe kind of exciting ideas inhabit a really high risk culture in relation to health and safety of workforces and operations, but also of the environment and society globally. And so we need to really think about looking beneath our feet. What have we got access to that can be accessed safely at a lower risk kind of scenario? So we did a project. It's a bit of an old project now, and people who know my work will have heard about this quite a bit. So I want to skip past some of these slides quite quickly. But between 2016 and 2020, we did a project looking at small deposits in Europe and how you could ramp up production from those. This map shows where there's lots of gaps of data, but that there's also an awful lot of small deposits that have been recorded across Europe. And we tried to ramp up production at a lead bulk and antimony critical metals, a couple of mine sites in Bosnia and Serbia in that 4-year program. And so that's just an infographic of the groups that were involved in setting up a whole mining value chain, because we recognize that one innovation on its own might fail to make any kind of impact at all in how we view mining. So we went from small scale cutting tools in A to a small scale containerized ore sorter B, comminution circuit C, and a gravity-based processing plant in D, which has a much, much smaller footprint than this tiny corner of the full plant that was under production at the first underground mine since the Yugoslav wars. So really, it was an experiment to look and see how easy it is to resolve a whole mining paradigm, understanding that small-scale mining does operate globally for gold deposits, but that it doesn't operate very well for critical raw materials and for a diversity of commodities. So what does it take to really make small-scale mining a more attractive option? And if we just sort of think a little bit about some of the outcomes of those experiments, we've got some pictures of the cutting tool there, where we were using that and it was designed to reduce the primary crushing needs of the ore deposit, and how we reduce transportation of materials and energy through using this kind of equipment. But the results of the limits to automation that we found were that there were some implications, so that we recognize that large-scale mining is intensive in capital investment and it removes workers from danger, but it also removes positive benefits from the community. In small-scale mining, we have low capital investment, and so we can't afford all those automated structures, but we also haven't got as much knowledge of the complex geologies, so that we actually need to be able to respond to changes in the ore deposit quite quickly. So we need to be able to read the rock more clearly. We need to be able to have some skilled labor to manage the cutting tools and techniques. And we need rapid cut-off safety controls in place. So this is really important, because it means that we need to change the narrative to move forwards with development of mining systems. We need to reduce workforces and increase automation. It changes that narrative to focusing on safety culture maturity. And certainly in the project, we did sort of talk a little bit about that, but the spin-offs from this 2016 to 2020 project, we're still trying to write up a huge body of literature that's been generated from that. So we'll hopefully see some more publications about safety culture maturity relative to scales of mining. Okay, we also did a life cycle analysis. I'll run through this pretty quickly because we're short of time, but the throughputs, the lower throughputs, the lower energy and water consumption, and the lifetime of equipment that's containerized were built into the functional unit of life cycle analysis. We did that environmentally and socially. And the environmental results with a number of metrics, two key takeaways are that toxicity related to equipment and waste management can be understood for small-scale mining, just as it can for established large-scale mining. And the need for a suitable electricity demand and supply system with relation to the carbon footprint is also really key. And we modeled that as well, thinking about the spatial footprint of raw materials, the renewable energy vectors that we have in different parts of Europe. And the really, really important thing is that for all our modeling, for all site locations across Europe, the optimum energy generation for a small-scale mining plant does not include diesel generators. And yet, diesel generators are still being used. So there's a real need for behavioral changes and changes in business modeling. With the social impact hotspots that were identified, the real key takeaway from the message was that a lot of the impacts weren't necessarily being felt at the mine site itself, because we built a lot of our infrastructure in the UK and transported it outwards. So the value chain and the way that the supply chain is connected up is really important about thinking about where and how big different impacts are. And the impact of climate change and flooding or fire events is all there as well. What also came out from the social science aspects about risks and perceptions of small-scale mining related to societal expectations of labour. So there is a feedback loop between automation, safety and labour there, which is really, really important. But that local public perceptions of scale of mining aren't recognised at all. So any prior experience of large-scale mining is taken forward into attitudes towards small-scale mining too. So the risks in the eye of the beholder are very different from the communities to the industrial practitioners. And I hope I'm going okay for time, but I've just got a couple more slides. So some new research that's coming out now in recognising that small-scale mining does operate globally, in recognising that small-scale mining is not ubiquitous with artisanal mining in the global south. There's been recent research done by Cassia Johnson about global north small-scale mining, going from artisanal all the way through to medium-scale mining in the Yukon, has been really, really insightful. Thinking about what it is that supports uptake of small-scale gold mining and how dynamic formalization and regulation can actually work to support small-scale mining operations, but that the economic structures for reporting act in contradiction to that, so that there's need for internal or alternative investment mechanisms to suit those small-scale operations where the output is not constrained by demand, but constrained instead by the owner-occupiers who have an expectation for living in a sustainable environment. Those structures of dynamic formalization and governance are not available equally globally, and Cassie will be writing up her research in Ghana as well to show how the ore geologies can impact whether environmentally sound technologies are adopted or not. And so there are some underlying geological constraints on whether that can happen, but also whether the system is geared to support miners to adopt technologies. So we have to think about, where is small-scale mining practice going to be adopted or impeded, particularly in relation to a wider range of commodities. So some unpublished stakeholder analysis that we've done, that hopefully will get out soon, is about where responsibility and risk for innovation lies. And for small-scale mining, that lies ultimately with small and medium enterprise technology providers, not with the mining users who would gather the greatest economic benefit from innovation. And so it's really, really important to recognize that there needs to be some resilience amongst the technology providers for how to do that. So the example I've got up there is where multiple applications can mitigate some risk. So Metal Innovations, the company that developed the cutting tool I showed earlier, have actually used it as a tunneling tool since, because take up by the mining industry is very slow. And so where can they actually develop their business model to manage that slow take up? The other real issue is that development costs of sustainable and adaptable solutions are very high relative to the unit sale costs, which is a very risky business because of a small market and low take up. And so this is where open innovation and working with the research institutes really helps to support those small and medium enterprises. The other problem we've got listed there is that it's not the responsibility of the mining company to actually show that an innovation is suitable to that mine site. The requirement for proving feasibility also lies with the technology provider. And so take up by mining companies can be very slow indeed. We find that that can be combated somewhat if we appreciate the value of the social and economic drivers, and how we actually build that into policy is really, really important, and how that can act to stimulate change. That's really important. So the necessary innovation cluster that we identify, or as Andy Reynolds put it, the model, the idea, needs to be really all-encompassing and extending beyond the technological, embracing the business models and the socio-environmental and open innovation research policy relations as well. So what's happening that's quite nice, that's moving forwards, that I wanted to flag, is the United Nations Resource Management System that's been created. And this provides a toolkit. This has been done by, this particular infographic is by Eva Marquis, working with Francis Wall, to develop a toolkit where we see that the competency of the company, the degree of geological confidence, the technical feasibility, is married very, very proactively with the economic, environmental, and social viability in a model of strong sustainability that builds in transparency and collaboration as well. So the rollout of this, it's been trialled in Cornwall in the southwest of England. It's being trialled next in Zambia, I think it is, and then we'll see how more widely it's rolled out. But this will work across the scales of mining, and that I see as quite an important innovation. So just to summarize a few takeaway messages, is that if we think place-based, we can de-risk to some extent global security issues. For small-scale mining, it is operating internationally, but to extend that to a wider range of commodities, to reduce criticality, to bring mining closer to home, there's quite a lot of paradigm shift that's required. And we need to do that thinking in a whole system across all of these jurisdictions. But there's some really, really exciting things that are happening, and some businesses that are really trying to enter this sphere for critical raw materials. But social innovation for development and enhanced environmental performance should be able to reduce those barriers towards uptake of new technologies over time. But the policy and community expectations are a really, really important part of that. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but hopefully we've got some time for questions, and I will stop sharing.
Kate, thank you so much. As always, absolutely fantastic. Round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Kate Waugh. Brilliant. Now, Kate, we are running a little bit short on time, and but there are a few questions both in the chat and also in the Q&A, which I'll let you answer. Just one question that has been coming through from a number of areas is, okay, so we've got the technology, we know how to do it, we've got the demand for those minerals and materials that this form of mining can extract. What's the blocker? Is it that large-scale mining kind of model that's constraining us, or what is stopping us from getting these smaller scale mining models actually rolling?
Well, there's not one thing. That's the real key takeaway. There's not one thing. There's investment. Is that there's not a long return on investment. So yes, it's not an attractive proposition to a professional investor when there are other mines that can be invested in. That's a really, really key takeaway. That's really important. Permitting is huge. And if it's close to economic viability, what happens, and how do you build the model that builds in mine closure for a short duration project? So those are really key critical things. And if you don't have adequate information, how do you actually get all the permits in place? So for a short-term mining operation, if you have long-term permitting issues, that's a real blocker as well.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Kate. We're going to have to move on to our next speaker, unfortunately, but you have lots of questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. And don't worry, they're not all from Andy Reynolds, but many of them are. Fantastic. Round of applause for Kate, everybody. Fantastic. Excellent. Our next speaker is the fantastic Casey, who is hopefully going to turn on his camera and start sharing his slides. So Casey is going to talk to us about streamlining battery mineral trade through digital channels. Now, I know you have a bit of a case study to share with us as well, Casey. So if you do want to share your slides, now is a good time. If not, just talk to us and we will all be very excited to hear what you've got to say. So Casey, over to yourself.
Thank you, Sarah and Kate. Can you see my slide?
No, we can't yet, unfortunately.
Okay, 1 minute. Let me get it.
That's okay. Just while Casey is sharing the slide deck at the moment, because we know that we can do it. We did the practice earlier on. So this.
Can you see it?
No, not yet. We can't. Aileen, did you have a copy of the slides? Yeah. Should we go for plan B, Casey? Let's go for plan B. And Aileen will share our slides. There we go. Fantastic.
Thank you.
So everyone, please put your hands together for the wonderful Casey. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kate, for setting the stage for small scale mining and what innovations you have been doing. So I represent Temisite. Temisite, we are an enterprises that we are building a social. We are social enterprises that we are mainly involved in building digital solution, digital infrastructure platforms, mobile applications. Next slide. Okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next slide, can you proceed? So just a context of Tanzania mining industry. We have large scale miners and we have small scale miners. The artisans and small scale junior mining companies, there's a population of roughly 2 to 3 million miners. So large concentration is in gold because, as you know, gold is money. You mine, you get paid, life goes on. But we have seen with the change in battery minerals, the high demand for battery minerals, your likes of graphite and lithium, they have changed the entire dynamics of the mining industry in Tanzania. We are getting lots of inquiries from traders, either being China, Europe, everyone wanting to buy what small scale miners are trying to produce. So what we are working on is building a mineral auction platform. With the support of USAID, we are focusing mainly in the battery mineral space, looking at 2 critical value chains, lithium and nickel mining in 2 different parts of Tanzania. So why we choose this, I think there's large volumes as we speak from lithium and nickel that is coming from small scale miners. So we are looking, in terms of volumes, we are looking about 100,000 tons that can come from small scale miners in a month. So buyers are in place, traders are in place, miners are in place. So our auction platform is a web-based and mobile-based, designed to bring buyers and sellers to the marketplace and do business. Now, what are we trying to achieve with this platform? Next slide. Next one. There are key issues that we are trying to achieve. Number one is remove smuggling. There's a lot of smuggling that is currently on the value chain. Not everyone knows the entire value chain of the mining ecosystem in Tanzania. Number two, there's lots of fraud. I'm a small scale miner. I can say I have X amount of lithium or nickel, which can be fake. It doesn't exist. So we start transaction. I take your money. I disappear. You cannot really get hold of me. So with our platform, we are trying to onboard genuine small scale miners who will be in the platform. Next slide. And the way we onboard them. Okay, so this gives you an overview of our infrastructure. Registration of miners and buyers. We're also working with trade and regulatory authorities. We're also working with financial and investment promotion agencies in terms of providing access to finance, because that's one of the biggest barriers that small-scale miners face. And we are also looking at partnership with mining equipment and technology provider. That's the entire ecosystem of our mobile app. Now, for the sake of financial services, most of artisan and small-scale miners cannot access banks because they cannot access financial services. And from the banks that we have discussed with, we are building an ecosystem where miners' data will be part of our platform. Because the challenge that most miners have is keeping data. They can't keep data from what they produce, what they sell, how much money are they making. So that's a big problem to them. So most banks say if we lend to these guys, they will either misuse of funds, they'll probably divert funds to something else. So they need to see that integrity in terms of we give you the loan, you're going to use it into your equipment or do what you plan as your business plan say. So our partnership with the banks is actually to bring small scale miners to have access to loans. So the challenge that we have seen is it's very difficult to open doors to the banks. So the banks will be part of the platform, looking at traders who are doing very well, looking at traders who need financing or miners who need financing, and then provide access to finance. In terms of partnership with equipment providers and technology, the gap that we have seen is most small-scale miners, because of their level of literacy and knowledge, they have no idea what this equipment costs or what it's all about. So in most cases, if they have to buy through a broker, they tend to pay overpriced equipment. So it's quite complicated. Next slide. Okay, so target number one is small-scale miners. I've already explained. So that's our larger volume, who are mining lithium and who are mining nickel. We are working with people who have licensed, who are already licensed with the Mining Commission. So we want genuine traders, or if you are not licensed, you have an agreement with a licensed owner to operate in his territory. Next slide. So this is the overview of, it's just the screen presentation of how our app looks like when you're on board. Next slide. So target number two, as I say, is traders, because the nature of our market is for these critical minerals, the buyers are not end users. They're not manufacturers, or they are not. So we have large chunk of traders who buy the material. So we want to onboard genuine traders to be part of that ecosystem, because the challenge we have right now, and it's very difficult, is there's lots of brokers. So everyone is a broker in the middle, wanting to be paid fees before you get to the final buyer. So traders will only vet the genuine traders who need material and partner them with the reliable providers of the minerals. Next slide. Okay, I've already explained about the buyers and suppliers of mining equipment. Can we move to the next one? So in terms of government and agencies and regulatory bodies, we are partnering with this in two dynamics. In Tanzania, we have a situation whereby with our primary mining license, because these are dedicated for small and artisan miners, everyone can afford to apply for a license. So it's not an issue, you can get a license. But most people tend to get licenses, they hold land, and they really develop their project. So when you go to the cadastral, the mining system, the entire country is almost booked, but no one is really developing or using any of their licenses. So we want to partner them with the investors. People will take a look at the license, take a look at your project description, and say, okay, can we work together to develop this lease or licensing area that you have? Because with our primary mining licenses here, most small-scale miners go straight into mining. They don't need a feasibility study. They mine, start trading. So there's a bit of we can help to de-risk the investment process, because it's very difficult to secure the right partners, the right investors who can work with you in terms of developing a mining project. So we have one of our investment promotion agencies in Tanzania. We're going to partner with them, sharing projects in our app, and also our project should be on their website to get traction of investors who will really be looking forward to work with artisan miners and the likes. Next slide. Civil society organization. We have signed a couple of MOUs with two civil society organizations in Tanzania. The aim is to provide a bit of transparency in terms of what is happening in the current marketplace, which is not, most people hardly know what really happens in this business. So our partnership is to see ways we can unlock ethical trading, probably other best practices such as environmental conservation, and also tackle the issue of rent seeking and high volumes of corruption that might be on the value chain. So, but basically, the strategy is to look at publish of what you pay, because most miners, the entire deals that they do, no one knows sometimes what really is happening. It might be behind the back payment. So we want to create a bit of transparency within the entire supply chain here in Tanzania. The next slide. So financial and investment institution, I've already explained about this. So we're next one. So basically, we are also integrating with payments infrastructure. We have local banks that will be part of our payment ecosystem within our mobile app. We are also, because large business right now is done through mobile apps, as you know, like the M-Pesas where you pay through mobile phone. So we have also done integration with mobile phone companies to allow seamless payment for the raw material. Next slide. Okay, investment promotion is already covered. I think I've already explained what we are trying to promote the projects. So in terms of our features, how do we plan to roll this out? We are going to use cutting edge, a bit of technology. As we know, most of miners are located in places that do not have access to the internet. So if you are off in the mining site, you should be able to upload your data within the app. And when you are into the internet zone, the app should get your information to the market. So that's one of the key features that we have built. I think this will really help because some of the mines are really remote where there's no access to data internet-based connectivity. Next slide. So offline mode, you should be able to get your information, the quantity you have produced, what you're looking to sell, and then when you're connected, business should be going. Next slide. So there's a bit of data compression that we'll be doing within the app to facilitate data transfer between users with limited data plan, because here internet is quite expensive as well. Also, users with limited internet access can provide feedback to us to improve the platform and also to do a bit of optimization. Next slide. So this is the entire value proposition for our system in terms of small scale miners, promotion of access to best prices, improve socioeconomic welfare, connect them to the best suppliers of equipment. We are working with government agencies. The potential we have seen with government agencies and within the value chain is the digitization, because everything in the mining value chain is largely paperwork. So it's just paperwork. So if we can automate your export clearance to apply, get it digital done. So we see a lot of value in terms of bringing digitization to the mining ecosystem. So I've said that, as I've already spoken with the buyers, current miners are not getting a lot of good pricing because, if there are very few remote buyers, then they control the price. So we hope with a large volume of buyers in the marketplace, there will be competition and miners will get better value for their produce and what they are working on. Next slide. So thank you. Basically, that's in a nutshell of the ecosystem we are building. So it's a mobile app, just to conclude, it's a mobile app that connects all these artisan mines across the country. Tanzania is quite vast. We have lots of resources that everyone is involved in mining. So we want to bring buyers and sellers together to do business. And the infrastructure, I know the question might ask, so how do we do testing and the results of the grades of the ore that we put on the app that sellers want, so the miners that want to sell. So before any material gets to the app for selling, for auction, we'll get the test results from the laboratories that we have here. So a buyer will see that in advance. And if he also wants to visit the warehouse and take samples for himself, that will also be part of we provide that services so that to be comfortable in terms of what is actually buying. And lastly, I think the business is happening. I mean, as we talk, critical minerals miners are mining. buyers are taking the material. So we want to make the place for them to get a good deal. Thank you. That's all about it.
Kaisi, thank you so much for that. Absolutely fantastic. Everyone, please, round of applause for the fabulous Kaisi. Thank you very much. Yay. We've got time for just a couple of questions, if we may. Oh, he's turned off his camera. He's gone. We've missed him. There he is. He's back. I'm sure you're still there. Kaisi, we've got a question in from Tanya in the chat, and Tanya's asking, could you please explain how data security is guaranteed on the app? Do you have any insight to that?
We are basically on the technology side. We are using the normal mobile app. The normal security features. I'm not from the tech side. I'm not a developer. So what our developers assured us is going to use the best security infrastructure to ensure that buyers and sellers' information is held tactfully. But just in terms of security, because for us the biggest issue is genuine information between different partners. So we want to know the miner that is on this platform, does he have a genuine mining license? Is he a genuine miner? That's the most critically important to us. And the buyer that comes on the platform, is he a genuine buyer? Does he have the genuine paperwork? Can he do live business? So to remove a bit of fraud that is part of this business in this part of the world. So that's what our focus priority at the moment is aligned to. So the tech stuff, I'm not very good at it, but I'm sure you're going to use a bit of encryption so that your information does not get in the wrong hands.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kaisi. And I'm sure, Tanya, we can find some more details on that for you as well. So that might be able to help answer your question. Kaisi, a question from myself. So we heard from Kate just before you about these amazing opportunities with regards to small scale mining. Now, I'm loving what you've done in terms of actually bringing the money or the ability to borrow money from a bank to the table of the miners. And then obviously, as you've very articulately shown us, those relationships with the governments on the permitting side, etc. So all of those different stakeholders. Is there anything, do you think, that could be taken into the world of small scale mining, say within Europe, in terms of trying to bring those different forms of financing to the table for a small scale mining company in the EU? What do you think? Do you think that would work in the same way as it does in Africa?
Absolutely. I think the issues, there are different types of financing for this type of projects. So you have offtake financing, you have loyalty financing, you have debt, equity. So I think the challenge is most miners or project developers really don't have grasp to what type of financing works. But in most cases here in Tanzania right now, we have, if you have an offtake agreement, you can take that to a bank and say, guys, this is my agreement. The buyer wants this amount of commodity, is ready to guarantee, let's say 10%. So bank gets comfortable, say, okay, we can lend you the equipment, start mining and get your material to the off-taker. So we have seen off-take agreement is the only thing that some of the banks here tend to appreciate and say, okay, we can start doing business. But outside of that, it's very difficult, because imagine you do not have any geological report, you have no data, you have nothing to start with. So how can I lend it to you? So the only thing that makes you look viable is, okay, here is my agreement. This is what my buyer wants for a month. So a bank says, okay, it makes sense. It checks with the buyer. The buyer is genuine, it can pay. So then the money will pass through that commercial bank's account. So they'll know they'll be deducting a bit of amount every month. So that creates a bit of trust. But I think it's very difficult to bring financing on board to type of these projects and players in any part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, Kaisi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
For sharing your app with us. Brilliant. Round of applause, everyone. Fantastic. Excellent. So we are going to move from that wonderful world of bringing everybody together in the form of an app. So it means that everyone can get on with producing all those raw materials in a responsible way, as of course we need them. We're now going to welcome to the stage Professor Richard Herrington, who I've had the great joy of doing a little bit of work with over the last few years and writing some papers, etc. with Richard. But Richard is going to share with us some of his insights into exploration for mine closure with regards to mitigating the risks of long-term liability. Now, Richard, we can see your PowerPoint like the raw format rather than presentation format. We can go with that if you like, or if you want to hit, there we go.
You might
like
prefer
a pro.
it, yeah, okay.
Fantastic. So everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Richard Harrington.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Sarah. And yeah, no further ado, just really want to actually pose the question, or pose the issue here, that actually exploration shouldn't be just also for the mine, the new resource. You should be exploring for the mine closure, because one of the recognitions, I think, is the fact that mine closure is one of the biggest risks that a mine has, and what that legacy might be. So I'm going to sort of turn things on their head, really, and explain what I mean by that. How do we build closure into the exploration process? I just really wanted to give credit to a couple of projects that I'm involved in. One is BioPlus Mine, which was looking at an abandoned mine site in the Philippines. There's a website there you can go to and have a look at that. And then also an EU project that we're doing, and Sarah's involved in that, called Vector, which is actually looking at, how do we move mining in Europe? How do we make it much more? How do we find the deposit, but also make it more acceptable as a process? So I'm going to move us on. Well, mining project risks. Let's have a quick look at those. And actually, if you just have to look at the EY top risks for mining and metals 2024, and you'll see big and large there, ESG sitting right at the top. And we see there in number 3, the license to operate. Obviously, capital is pretty important, but if we are looking at project risks, those two there, the license to operate and ESG are writ large. And so we've got environment and we've got social in there, and we're going to unpick those a little bit. The major identified risk areas, some of which I'm not going to talk about. So there's the technical and financial risk, and obviously we see capital in there. Number 2, people are worried about that. But I'm going to focus a bit more on the sort of the societal and ecological part of that. And that's definitely links into the closing of the mine. Because for any mining project, lots of people are very excited about the mine opening, but there are a heck of a lot of people who are interested in what that mine is going to look like when it closes. And that's a really big risk. And we know that actually the mining itself can suffer from technical failure. These give mining a bad name. These failures are not entirely a surprise, but they're often because perhaps the right information about the ore body or its wastes were not collected, and that the design of the mining operation and certainly its post-mining landscape weren't perfectly well designed. And obviously, if one of these facilities is going to fail during the lifetime of the mine, you better make pretty sure that when you walk away and close the mine, it isn't going to fail, during the legacy period of the mining. And we've got plenty of examples out there that, this is the reason when mining gets a bad name. It's the least favourable of any of the sectors, industrial sectors. If we did a survey in Europe, it's the least popular of those sectors. And that's because we see closures with no agreed plan, because they, in this case, this mine in Portugal was closed to avoid incoming mine closure legislation. And we know that legislation is going to change, and it's only going to get tighter as we go forward. And so actually we ought to be looking at ways of creating a gold standard so that we don't leave these, we're not left with a situation that when a mine closes, we leave a legacy like this behind. Because actually that environmental issue is linked into the social issues here, because this mine in Portugal, when it closed, it left an environmental disaster, and of course everybody lost their jobs. So that was like a double whammy. And then we have some really bad situations still, where mines still officially remain open, but they're abandoned and unreconstructed. And so there's still very few examples of fully certificated mines that have gone through that rehabilitation process and are transferred back to a third party, be it the government or whatever. And so those mines that lack closure certificates aren't actually closed. Huge, I mean, I've just picked South Africa here, but we know that there's a legacy of this worldwide. This is an old coal mining area in South Africa. This guy was a miner, and he lost his job, and he's trying to make a living from a very degraded site. So the mine is shut, jobs are lost, social environmental issues. And as I said here, mining now has the lowest rating of all sectors by the public. We also have ethical failure, and this should be also part of the problem. It's one of the big risks. This is certainly avoidable. I don't need to mention this anymore, and I won't go into any detail. But that's also an enormous risk. Now, we heard that word trust, and of course, last year the conference was all about building trust. And actually, this is what mining projects should be doing. They should be building trust from the start, from that exploration, that first foot on the ground. Trust should start then. And so the social aspect is really ultra important. And it's more than social engagement. It's more than social acceptance, license or license to operate. Because there's emotion in there. And actually, you can't get around that. And there was a great paper by Segerson and Thisted in 2021 that said, without hope, potentiality, engagement, minerals will stay in the ground. So unless people are really wanting this to happen, the minerals will stay in the ground because you'll have people blocking it. And it's interesting that even PwC talk about trust being a critical material. So establishing trust with all equity owners from the start is essential. And so I think this is one of the biggest risks of failure that's out there. And we know plenty of occasions where trust is lost during the exploration stage. And that's because things have been done wrong. I won't get into the specifics of what was done wrong, but we've got an enormous lithium resource in Serbia that should actually be helping resource our green economy, and nothing's happening there because there are issues. There was a big breakdown of social issues there. Tambo Grande in Peru is another great example where nobody talked to the local farmers who just got deals to build new farms, and then a mining company comes along and wants their surface land. And that's because there's opaque permitting, no joint purpose from government and other agencies, imperfect practices. And of course, at the exploration stage, that can cloud a project from ever being started. So Portugal, which was looked upon as one of the best places to look for lithium, it's practically impossible to get anything off the ground. We know that there are different approaches can have different outcomes. So even in Cornwall, two people looking for minerals in different parts of Cornwall had different approaches. Again, I'm not going to comment on the details of it, but in one area, you had investors crowding in to become equity holders in an operation, in a project. And then we have another project which has got a similar intention, where the residents are up against it. And clearly there are different approaches here, one of which worked and one of which didn't. And so what we need to build in these to reduce that risk is that need for shared ambition. I put those 3 diagrams up there that were nicely summarized by Purvis. We need to get the social, the environment, and the economic right to get that sustainable intersection. And people have done it as pillars, but actually I like the embedded circles, because we need to deliver all positively in all 3 elements and develop circularity in each of those areas. And this can only be crafted at the beginning. And so the new paradigm for mining has to be something where we have a process that's inherently regenerative, that's built inside that social, I call it a license. It's not a word that everybody likes, but a social where people accept that because they're going to benefit from it, and there'll be a long-term positive, sustainable legacy for people. And then that's all embraced inside a circularity in the environmental concerns. And so I think this is where we need to be building. And we know that these things have to be led to be able to build things like a vision for the future. And we have some wonderful visions. We have something like the Eden Project, which is an old mining venture. But actually, in a way, that's what we'd like to have. So we've got informed co-creation of something that actually probably has left a legacy that might even be better than the mining itself, dare I say. And so one of the ways forward in that is something that we've been trialing in this Philippines project, and a sort of a form of social exploration where you develop a system with the local people. And it's very difficult. So you have to use grounded theory methodology, which is really just data driven, where you collect the data and then you work out how you can go forward. There's no sort of imposed thing you can do. You have to work with those people. And so we can use this social economic technical solution to develop, put in there the geology, the idea of the post-mining landscape, what it might be, farming, food cache, and the infrastructures, and see how all of that can work together to get something that is socially acceptable. And this has to happen right at the beginning. And we need to marry that with good data collection so that we can manage the material flows, the stocks and the flows of the operation, both for the ores and the waste. We need to collect data about the ecosystem so that we understand that completely fully, so we can reconstruct that. And then we can move that on to where we can start to build these truly circular economies from a linear economy that brings in all of those, understanding the full materials and other parts of the natural capital, which includes the nature and the people, and establishing the true value of the mining to that particular region. And then make sure we do that in a transparent, accountable way and reduce that risk. So my mantra here is the trust bit, which we did last year. We know we've got to rebuild that trust and learn from our past failures. So be honest about those things. And then view raw materials and the circular economy as interconnected and dynamic. Measure that value in true terms. Improve how we mine, obviously, but embed stakeholders from the start rather than responding later when obligated to. So actually have this social exploration alongside your technical exploration. And industry needs to be proactive about what it's doing to change. And let's demonstrate the people that are doing it right, let's demonstrate that behavior and make sure it's transparent and accountable. So thank you very much. I think that's all of my slides. And so I will end my slideshow there and stop sharing. And
there we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Round of applause, everyone. Fantastic. Excellent. And Richard, yeah, thank you again, not only for using the little infographic or piece of art that we put together for this conference. So gold star for you. Fantastic. But also as well, citing the chapter in a book that we managed to put together over the last year, which is exciting. We'll put a link to that into the chat as well. Now we've got a question that's come in from Michael in the chat. And Michael asks, where does governance fit into the pillars or embedded circles to contribute to sustainability and building trust? What do you reckon?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, part of this is that you hope that the governance will be built in there, that the industry would be able to regulate itself. But if you start building it with the people themselves, I think you build that governance structure. And rather than imposing governance, you sort of have to build something where everybody is an equity holder in it. So you can have people that might adjudicate on it. So people like the ICMM for the large, big industry might be that the way you do that. But I think the governance of a project on a scale of one in Cornwall or one in Tanzania would be, let's do something that's fit for purpose governance in that region, obviously guided by best practice around the place. But actually because I think the biggest barrier, the biggest risk is this social aspect. And it's also the thing that delays things so much. I think part of the reason mines take 17 years plus to get in is because we do the governance in a sort of an imposed way, whereas actually if you've done all that work at the beginning yourself, you've got all the people who might be the critics involved in it. The governance is done internally all along the way. I don't know if that helps as a view, but that's certainly what I would see.
Great, thank you for that, Richard. There's a question that actually has already been answered by one of our previous speakers that was posed in the Q&A, and this is from Andy. And Andy was asking, is there a business model that spreads technology risk, but I'm going to expand that to other forms of risk across numerous small mines or small assets? What do you reckon, Richard? Do you think if you get lots of small assets and then you think, well, hang on a second, if we manage these as a interconnected whole or a consortium or something, can you share some of the risk or the controls for those risks? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably have to go to agriculture. I mean, I always think mining is a bit like agriculture, and you know, in a way, we've got that great saying, haven't we? If you don't mine it, you've got to grow it. So I think those are the two things that society do. So it's a bit like, how do you get together cooperatives on small production of vegetables or whatever? So I think you develop some kind of marketing strategy where that might get sold, local markets. I think we heard a really good talk there from the previous talk, Casey there, that, you know, where you could get some people to collectivize activity. And so I think you do have to build sort of cooperatives to do that, to help, because you're right. But then there's an opportunity to share technologies, to share equipment even, because farmers do it all the time. You know, they have these big consortia that own maybe tractors, you know, because you only use a tractor or a combine at one time of the year. So why not share it with other people? And so I think maybe moving towards those kind of things might be good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of precedents that are set for this. So as a very personal example, my mum and dad, who farm in the northeast of Scotland, they're thinking about moving to a different form of sowing the seed. But that's really expensive. And one of the blockers is actually having access to the equipment, not for us to go and buy the equipment, but actually any contractor in the region having access to that equipment. So I think perhaps there's lots we can learn there. One final question before we move on to our next lovely speaker. And that question comes from Jim, Richard. And Jim's asking, have you found the reduction of cost of the environmental bonds to the mining after the closure is being used? Is there actually money being provided for that particular bonding or those funds, or are the mining companies simply taking the cost off their books and moving on? What do you reckon?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Jim. And I think the problem is, again, because these are imposed things. So legislators are talking about these bonds. Actually, so what we're saying is, yes, there should be kind of a credit for collecting all this data up the front end. And it's almost like we need to value and I didn't show the slide there, you know, of a value of a project. So you can look at the stock market, use the Lassonde curve as to a value of a project through its life cycle. And you realize the exploration side of it's not got much value till you find something and start mining. You earn your big money in the downscale cost, and you wonder whether you could borrow from that end to fund the work that needs to be done at the front end, that will mitigate the problem at the end. Somehow you need to sort of be able to pay forward. So I've always thought that, you know, it's when you're in your own career, you get your money when you're too old. I always wanted a sports car when I was young. I can only afford it now. I can't see to drive the thing properly. So I think maybe we need to bring that sort of stuff into the mining. Look, there's an expectation you've got to earn money down let's put the money at the front to make sure that the end game, you know, you can close the door at the end of the mining and walk away because you've done such a good job of building that post-mining landscape and so on.
Yeah, and I think that triggers another thought in my mind, and don't worry, we will move on to Ellie in a second, I promise. And that, again, is taking that proxy from the world of farming. So this need to change the way in which we farm to move to a more regenerative approach, and we can draw lots of similarities or learnings between, I think, farming and mining. And this is something where we're in the middle of a project right now where we pulled together the entire supply chain. And so what this is doing is saying, well, hang on a second, the people who actually distill our barley into whiskey, so the whiskey distillery, they obviously have a vested interest in making sure that the input materials or the ingredients that go into their whiskey are grown in the most sustainable way possible. And that's something where, of course, from a farming perspective, you want a higher price for your barley, but there are other things in there as well, such as actually maybe the distillers can input funding into that consortium of people buying equipment so that the farmers have a lower barrier to entry in terms of changing the way that they do things.
No,
so this is something, do you think there's a similarity there into mining?
I do. Well, let's take the Eden project for a case in point. You know, that was not funded by the mining company, and you know it's generated 2.7 billion for the local economy. It took a different vision for that end of mine life, and so I think it involves more than miners, because those I think you need to get all of those players in there, and so therefore perhaps the value of that thing like the Eden project was bigger than the mine itself. So actually, if we can start thinking about that full life cycle and the end game, it's a bit like your whiskey. If you can then end up producing whiskey that can sell for £1,000 a bottle, you know, as a miner, you're just thinking, or a farmer, you're thinking about barley. But actually, you've got to think at the real end game. And you know, if you can do things in a better way that will give you something at the end that will be a prize that you don't think about because it's outside your own scope. So I don't think the China clay miners had any thought about building a biome, you know. So yeah,
exactly. So this is about having the vision into the future and then thinking, well, hang on a second, how can we leverage that in terms of that long-term value rather than that short-term gain that we might get? Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. As always, round of applause, everybody, for Richard Harrington.
Thank you.
Awesome. Excellent. So we're going to go on into our next lovely speaker. And our next speaker who we will welcome to the stage is the wonderful Ellie Shaw. So Ellie, now is the moment to hit that unmute button, share the screen, all manner of those buttons that you might need. And I'm really, really excited about this presentation because it's called The Mine We All Want to See. And I think there's a slight element of ironicness, as it were, in there, because those appear to be farm sheds, Ellie. I think you're going to tell us all about it in a second. Everyone, round of applause for the wonderful Ellie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that is the plan for the Woodsmith mine. So eventually, you know, when everything is built and they're in operations, that's what it's going to look like up above Whitby. Which is why sort of that is, I guess that is kind of the mine we all want to see because it looks like sheds. But, right, so, hang on, let me just click. Okay, so, good afternoon. My name is Ellie Shaw and I am joining you from Horsham today. In the UK, I work for ERM, who are the world's largest sustainability consultancy. And I need a little bit of history in this to sort of explain where we're coming from. So ERM acquired CSA Global, who were a sort of mining and geology specialist consultancy operating for, this would have been the 40th year. So ERM come from a background of sustainability and environmental services. So with this acquisition, what that's actually done is sort of, we've built a sustainable mining services team. And this sort of feeds on from what Richard's been saying, which was really relevant in the fact that, you know, we've been quite siloed before. So now we've kind of created this team of professionals who cover all the different bases. And the vision that comes out of this is the mine that we all want to see. Now, I do have a couple of Slidos in there, so I don't know if you would feel happy to navigate over to slido.com and let's see if this works Alternatively, there is a QR code. So what do you think of when you think of the mine that we all want to see? Obviously, if you type in a few words, then fingers crossed, they will appear. If they don't, then, you know, two people are typing. This is great. Fantastic. So minimal impact on the environment, community engagement, hidden. Yeah, perfect. We want to make sure that greener, low impact, local community support, circular resources, clean, attractive. Everything's very aesthetic, isn't it? Opportunities, sustainable. Now this is awesome. I'm conscious of time, so I am gonna jog on quite quickly. If I can find my mouse, there it is. So on our side, we've got a bit of a vision for it, and it's sort of providing like that framework that we can all use to actually put together a sustainable mine that means that we can achieve the best practices for the best value. So the approach behind this, right, so here we go, typical conventional mine life cycle. You know, you start off in your generative, and you've got these sort of stage gates as you go through. If we consider ourselves on a journey together today, then these are almost traffic lights. You know, at each of these points, you will make a decision on the project. You know, you'll push more capital into it. You'll get more data. You know, one of the biggest feed into your operation is information. And, you know, whether that's at the exploration stage or as you gather more data as you come through feasibility into your actual mine development. But then at the end, you know, you've still got, you know, you don't want to be thinking about mine closure when you hit the end of operations, you know, and back to what Richard was saying, that needs to come right back in at the exploration phase. So, I mean, typically what we do, you know, you find your asset, you just push everything to get it into production. You know, we need to get to the next financing decision. We need to get to this point and this point, but it creates these sort of silos, and you're losing opportunity at each of these stages to be gathering some of the information that you need to be able to sort of be getting more opportunity from it. So, and yeah, just mentioning that, you know, it tends to go into, oh, you know, we'll think about that down the line, such as, you know, in the past, I would say mine closure has often been one of those things. So what we're trying to do is kind of take all that underlying data and that value and put that into a total value per block within the mine life cycle. What it does is, so rather than this linear approach, you know, we're thinking of it in a circular approach. So we want the information from each of these phases to all be feeding into that value per block from the beginning. And they are supported by those pillars that are integral to building the mine that we all want to see, which is, you know, your mine planning, your water, your ESG, the stewardship, you know, that overarching sort of holistic movement. And then, you know, carbon and the regeneration. So looking at that, thinking about our value per block and the topic of, you know, this conference, next question, what do you think are the main risks to mining operations? And if you saw Mark's talk earlier, you might have a couple of ideas around what might be coming up. And again, you know, that's if people are still here and haven't sort of potted away while I've been talking. Technical risks, public opposition, communities, governance. so a lot of this, and again with the sort of EY24 diagram, which says, you know, ESG is the biggest risk. And that's kind of why I'm talking today, because I'm a geologist, but within the team, you know, we want to combine it all. We want to be able to integrate the geology side and that technical side with the ESG and the environmental. And that's how we believe that we can build the mine you all want to see. We all want to see, you, me, everyone. But yeah, so, whoa, no rocks in the ground. Oh, okay. No, that's all right. So, but yeah, and what I'm going to do, we're going to head back to our little journey. Here we go. What is this? Worst case scenario. We're chugging down the road, and what we're actually trying to avoid, in all seriousness, is these potholes. You know, we're all familiar with them. You know, you come in and your ore's not where you expected it to be, but it's understanding why. You know, is the drill spacing unsuitable? Is the ore body much more complex than we were anticipating? Are you over mining or under mining? You know, considering that more tonnage through the crusher does not necessarily mean more metal. You know, so if you're mining and, you know, it's extra cost, it's extra comminution costs for the crushing, your reagents in the process plant, you know, the space in the tailings, they're all things that can be avoided. So it's looking at this in the sort of risk sense, you know, because if you can sort of fix potholes before they actually turn into big old potholes, then it's going to leave you in a much better situation and less of an emergency, you know, that, oh my gosh, the recovery's tanked. And so what I'm going to do is move, and again, I'm focusing a little bit geologically, but that's where I sit. But basically potholes can be avoided. Oh wait, so that's my mum in a massive pothole. So, you know, don't do that to mum. So this is a much greener looking image. Obviously the red one signifies terrible. But this is kind of more of what we're thinking. So you're on the same path, you know, you're going through these linear stage gates. As you get more information, the confidence in your block model is increasing. But you're using these tools like ore body intelligence, for instance. You know, getting that geometallurgical data early on helps to build a better process, you know, optimize your plan. Reconciliation is a hugely important factor, as we all know, tracking our ore and making sure that it goes to the right place, but also identifying areas where things aren't doing what they're supposed to be. That's the purpose of a good reconciliation practice. So I didn't mention at the beginning, but there is a bio. I've basically spent the majority of my career on mine sites, and often we do get the sort of pushback from your senior management that says, oh no, we don't need to look at that right now. It's not really a problem. But it's one of those things where if you sort of quantify, if you could send an extra 5 777s, about 100 tons, at 2.5 grams per ton gold to the processing plant, you can make an extra $100,000. You know, so when is the time to really be looking at those potholes is kind of the question I'm getting to. No more pictures of mum. That's sort of, you know, that's the whole thing integrated. So all of the different study stages, and also looking at, you know, tailings closure, the ESG side of things. So that's the sustainable mining services approach. But obviously within geology, there's also, it's kind of how, it's that circular approach of how is what we think is the best way to go about trying to fix some of these issues. So, you know, if you identify these crucial areas, but the earlier you can design and plan well at these stages of operation, is the more opportunity to add value. And that's basically what it is. It's, you know, it's finding out where your gaps are, designing a roadmap to fill them. You know, what points are you measuring, agreeing on a roadmap, you know, collaborating. The people on site are the ones who know most about your ore body, and that's really important. Just for sort of feeding into that direction, and then sort of capturing that data, tracking it, improving it, and then guiding to success. So I've got a case study here. So this is a new mining operation that was opening. I mean, we had a strong relationship with them already, but their team had sort of like limited open pit experience. The deposit itself was particularly complex. So sort of using this circular and this sort of holistic approach geologically as well, you know, working through these areas allows you to actually reach the goal. And obviously the goal for this was to get the project on track. They achieved ramp up within 3 months, and they've consistently hit their production targets. So it's coming back to looking at these things early on in the process and trying to do things right from the beginning. Because there's typically they're common issues, but it's just hard to sort of work through them sometimes. And coincidentally, this client, they did come back because the other issue that they had was clays. So again, you know, it's the recovery issue. You know, we've got clays coming in, we're not sure where they're coming from, you know, where are those measure points? And to track that material actually made a huge impact on the recovery. So really, really important to be looking at. So I will finish up there. So that's my email if anyone has any questions outside of this, and LinkedIn. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Ellie. Absolutely brilliant and really interesting to see what everybody was thinking, I think, in terms of the mine as a whole. One question for you before we move on to our next little fireside chat that we're going to have, and that is you spoke about when you've been working on site and where there's some very obvious improvements perhaps that can be made either immediately or something that's going to lead to benefit over the long term, and the potential reticence, shall we say politely, of senior leaders to acknowledge or listen to those ideas, let alone implement them. Do you have any hints or tips as to how you can better approach those senior leaders to get them on board and maybe think that it's all their idea?
Absolutely. And it sounds awful, but they're very value driven. You know, the dollar signs are really what does it. So if you can actually show by doing this, this is how much money has been saved, this is the value added. You know, think blast movement, for instance. You know, if you can say, using this blast movement, this is how much ore loss and dilution was not value lost by sending things to the wrong place. And then I find you get buy-in very quickly.
So try and speak in their language, I guess, would be another way.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Fantastic.
And, don't geologically overcomplicate it.
What?
I know, I love it, but not everyone else does.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ellie. Unfortunately, we need to move on to the next presentation, but fantastic. Yes. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Great. Now, what we're going to do now is we are going to welcome both Michael Barron to the stage, and I'm hoping, I think he's somewhere in the attendees. Can people help me with this? There we go. I can see him. He's raised his hand. We need to upgrade Mark Robinson, please, because he needs to be able to speak to us just now. So if somebody wants to upgrade them, that would be great. And Mark, if you want to hit the big blue button, that will bring you into the panel, which would be great. But we're going to have a little chat with Mark. And I'm going to be joined by my partner. I'm just going to say partner in crime, but that doesn't sound very good, does it, Michael? Michael, would you like to introduce yourself just while we get just while we get Mark set up? Do you want to introduce yourself, and then we will get cracking?
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Yes. Hello, everybody. As Sarah just said, my name is Michael Barron. I'm an independent consultant based in the UK. I used to work, actually, I feel a bit of an intruder here because I actually used to work in the oil and gas sector rather than the mining sector. But I've had a long association one way or another with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So it is a great pleasure to welcome to the floor or to the stage Mark Robinson, the Executive Director of EITI since 2018, I think it was. We're going to change the format here. So rather than do a presentation, it's going to be more like what's sometimes called a fireside chat. So a series of questions, cover some of the topics we've been looking at over this session, so about risk and critical minerals and so forth. But before we do that, Mark, maybe for the benefit of those in the audience who are maybe less familiar with EITI, if you could just briefly introduce the initiative and say a bit about how it works and its role in improving or bringing transparency and accountability, in this case, particularly to the mining sector. I know EITI covers oil and gas, but we are talking more about mining today. So, Mark, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and many thanks, Sarah, to you for the kind invitation. So the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, is a global multi-stakeholder initiative set up to tackle the problems of poor governance and corruption risk in oil, gas, and mining worldwide. And we are now 56 member countries. About 65 leading oil, gas, and mining companies support our work, and possibly 800 civil society groups around the world engaged in EITI implementation. So we in Oslo, where I'm based at the International Secretariat, provide support to EITI implementation around what we call the EITI standard, a reporting framework right along the extractives value chain on which countries need to report progress. And we also conduct periodic assessments, which we call validation, which we then publish with recommendations how countries can improve transparency across the sector.
Thank you. And so with that, as you say, the EITI standard has been in place for about 10 years, and the EITI itself has been in existence for about 20 years. Last year, you updated the EITI standard, and energy transition was very much one of the themes of that update. So people listening and watching this, what can they expect to see in this EITI reporting that will be useful in terms of understanding the risks around the exploration and exploitation of critical minerals in the 56 implementing countries?
Sure. I mean, the defining purpose of EITI is to support countries in their quest to increase revenues from the sector, oil, gas, and mining, but also to tackle and curb corruption risk. Those have been, have been the defining features of our work over 20 years. What changed 4 or 5 years ago when I and Helen Clark, as our board chair, came in is recognizing that the context in which we work is rapidly changing, and we could no longer ignore the significance, the impact of the energy transition. So with that, our board, the board took a decision to develop a series of policies to further our work and contribution to the energy transition, and then brought it into the EITI standard last year, the 2023 standard. So there's already in the existing standard a number of provisions which help countries as they confront and tackle governance and corruption risks. Some of those include, for example, contract disclosure, which has been there now for at least 8 years and is now a mandatory requirement. All governments need to put contracts into the public domain as of January 2021 that they enter into with private companies. That's absolutely fundamental to safe, sustainable mineral supply chains, because those companies engaging in contracts need predictability. They need to know that the counterparts they're working with are acting in good faith. And of course, it's important for those that they work with in joint ventures and other contractual arrangements. So that's been long in place, along with beneficial ownership transparency, in order to understand the real owners of companies. That's really important for companies which are entering into many complex contracts with companies that may not be publicly registered, state-owned enterprises, to understand who's the real owners. Are there vested interests there, or politically exposed persons who have a strong personal stake in making corrupt proceeds from transactions? So those, and I suppose the third one, Michael, I draw attention to, which is pre-existing and fundamental for supply chain risk management, is around commodity trading transparency. A requirement that the volumes and the sales of commodities by commodity traders are put in the public domain. And in my mind, this is one of the most important, because what people often forget about in the excitement about critical raw materials is actually how are they collected, stored, and transported. This is vital, and that's where a lot of the corruption risk lies. So that's what's already there. What changed last year is new provisions around public policies of governments around the energy transition, declaring their own policy framework, which many governments have only still been developing, including how they publicize subsidy regimes. This is important across both sectors, particularly in oil and gas, but also around some mining as well. A second one is publication of information about reserves. Now, that was a big fight in amongst my different constituencies, and it sounds very innocuous, but it's absolutely fundamental for countries and companies to, or countries to publish information about known reserves of minerals and other extractives. And the third one is around better forecasts, excuse me, of revenues from the sector going forward and putting that into the public domain. All this body of information is designed to deepen the way in which this standard can add information on the energy transition, Michael.
Thank you. I'm sure that's raised, especially for Sarah, given her mining background, raised lots of questions. So Sarah, I know you're probably itching to come in.
Yeah, so Mark, with regards to all of that, so you've mentioned some of those changes perhaps that are going on in the broader world at the moment with regards to those aspects that are addressed perhaps within EITI. Are you seeing that there are some really good partnerships and collaborations, and so therefore influencing of either how EITI is being updated, but then also how other agreements, guidance, etc. are put together? Do you see any of that?
Yeah, there is important cross-fertilization. You may be aware there's a conversation happening in New York as we speak, which is looking for better harmonization of a number of reporting standards. In this case, not the EITI, but aspects of the EITI report inform this, designed to lessen the reporting burden on companies, which many are feeling at the moment. Because since the EITI was created 20 years ago, there's been a number of other standards that have evolved around particular metals, around aspects of the value chain. So we are, in fact, my colleague, my deputy is in New York in part of that discussion to make sure that our focus on governance and on community engagement is very strongly reflected in whatever they then produce. So ICMM and their companies, who are all members of the EITI, a key partner. On the NGO side, there's a number of key NGOs that play a very important advocacy role around giving emphasis to these sorts of priorities and to hold companies and governments accountable for their public commitments on what they wish to do to improve governance, whether under the EITI or other reporting frameworks. So those are two very, very important segments that we work with. And then you have institutional frameworks like the OECD's due diligence guidance on supply chains in conflict-affected environments. You have the World Bank playing an important role around a number of agreements and funding mechanisms that we also work closely with. So we are part of a much broader institutional framework and set of partnerships as opposed to going it alone. Although when we started out 20 years ago, that was a pretty lonely furrow. There was very few other actors in this domain and very little information and data in the public domain. And my gosh, that's changed, and partly as a result of our collective efforts.
Thanks, Mark. Michael, back to you.
Yeah, so actually on that last point, as you say, EITI has put a lot of information and data into the public domain. How are, and you mentioned NGOs there and the companies, both of which are, important, two of the three key constituents in the EITI, particularly NGOs, not just for advocacy, but how are NGOs, civil society organizations, using EITI information that comes out through the EITI process to have impact, to affect real change, to improve transparency and accountability in the country, in the EITI implementing countries, or indeed, are there any instances of it being used outside of EITI, but focus on EITI?
One of the most important networks in that regard is the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a sort of advocacy-oriented think tank, which is present in many EITI countries. They're a big user of our data, whether it's to have a repository of information they can feed their state-owned enterprise database, whether it informs their guidance on anti-corruption in the extractive sector. So that's probably one of the best examples of how our data is used by an organization, both to inform its constituents, but also to support its advocacy efforts. Oxfam International is another big user of our data and also has helped feed in and develop some of our own standard itself. They're not just recipients of, but they actively shape the way in which the standard has been evolving over the years. So it's a two-way street in that respect. And both of them have extensive networks in many of the countries we work in. So our primary engagement in terms of country involvement is that their associate bodies or partners on the ground who take part in the EITI multi-stakeholder groups. So they provide that mechanism between our data, ensuring it's taken up and used both for global policy, but also for country level efforts. And increasingly at the subnational level to inform local communities. Now that's a massive task, just simply given the sheer number of mining sites around the world. But we are experimenting at the moment with what kinds of information from EITI can be used by community level organizations to inform local public debate and awareness of the potential benefits that should accrue to local communities from new investments. What are the transfers coming from governments? What are the job opportunities that should be available from new investments? All of that now has been fed in part by some of our data, particularly in Latin America, Peru and Colombia, where there's already subnational EITI implementation taking place. Thank you.
And just maybe a final question for me on companies, and coming close to my heart, coming from a private sector background. As you said, the standard has evolved over the last 10 years, and the latest iteration was published in June 2023. And that the latest version seems to put a lot more obligations on companies to disclose information. You talked about anti-corruption policies. There's obligations around environmental and social impact assessments and other things. And we've talked earlier this afternoon a lot about small and medium-sized mining companies. So the question is, which may not have the resources or the capacity to manage much of this. So what are the expectations, and in your view, on small and medium-sized mining companies to contribute to EITI in the implementing countries?
let me start with how we work with companies more broadly. Until recently, until the last few years, there hasn't been any reporting obligations on companies because the standard is primarily reporting for governments who then in turn collect information about companies in their respective countries. Now, what we brought in 2 years ago was a set of expectations for company reporting. That's for the member companies of the EITI, mainly the publicly listed companies and increasingly a number of SOEs. 9 expectations, some of which you listed just now. Do they have a published position on combating corruption? Are they committed to contract transparency? Do they publish their beneficial owners, paralleling the EITI standard? And we last year then undertook a stock take about how far our companies actually living up to that set of expectations. And that was published initially in aggregate and now by each individual company. So there's a very extensive data set on our website, which can be mined. So each individual company can be measured up against these standards, which is very useful for ESG reporting, of course. Now, your question was more about companies in country and the smaller companies. Huge numbers of companies have to provide data for government reporting on the EITI. It probably amounts to several thousand. And what we find is, of course, the mining sector often is dominated by a few large players, many of them international companies, some of them domestic, and some of them SOEs. But you have a very, very large tail of medium and small scale enterprises, of course. And a significant segment of them do report on the EITI, but each country makes a decision about what is the level of materiality, how significant does their production investment need to be before they're obliged to report. So it doesn't make sense for very, very small micro companies, family-based companies, to report because it's so tiny in the wider realm of government reporting. But nevertheless, there are just take, say, Chile, a country which is committed to joining EITI, hopefully to be our next member before the end of the year, where the sector is dominated by large companies, both domestic and international, but there's a very large sector of medium-sized, family-based mining companies. They will be reporting through the EITI, and they're collected and represented through an association in Chile, which until quite recently was not particularly enamored with the idea of having to open up and to report through the EITI. But that conversation has been taking place, and gradually the recognition that actually that can be a good thing in terms of creating investor confidence and bringing more money into the sector. So there are limits to the reporting insofar as micro industries cannot and would not report through the EITI, but there's still a very significant segment of medium and small companies that do and should.
And I think we're probably out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Sarah to wrap up. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very, very much, Michael, but also thank you so much, Mark, for joining us here today and being grilled by all of Michael's questions there on EITI and a lot of the change that actually it's helped instigate across the world. So thank you very much to both Mark and to Michael. Round of applause to both of you. Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to go back to our main area. Here we go. So we can all see everybody now, which is fantastic. And we're going to invite Pavel to turn on his camera and his microphone. And I know that, Pavel, you're going to speak to us, so I'm going to spotlight you in a second. And Pavel, if you want to start off by introducing yourself to everybody, but I'm excited because we've just talked about things like tax transparency, etc. And now we're going to go into that wonderful world of transparency of supply chains. So everybody, if you can please put your hands together for the wonderful Pavel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. It's Pavel Verkhnyavsky here, and I'm the managing partner at COSA. Well, basically, we mostly deal with corporate intelligence, so we look a lot into the details of supply chains, into backgrounds of entities and individuals around the world. We're based in Kyiv in Ukraine, with presence in some other countries like the United Kingdom, Pakistan, Lithuania, Turkey, and we also have a small team in the United States. Well, we're dealing a lot with sanctions regimes lately due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and you probably noticed sanctions regimes imposed against entities in that country. And coincidentally, many of those entities are related to critical minerals and resources, critical resources that are still needed in many industries, including the defense one. So when we speak about sourcing responsibly, we usually mean environmental issues, but also corruption risks, as the previous speakers have just mentioned, and also human rights, of course. And these days, all of these issues not only remain important, but actually become critical and touch upon such matters as national and international security. And in today's geopolitical situation, when global powers are competing for military dominance, with critical minerals and materials playing a crucial role, the transparency of supply chains become even more important. And by the way, there is even a theory that the Kremlin started its war in Ukraine to get hold of the Ukrainian lithium deposits. Obviously, it's just a theory, and I think there's much more to that war. But yes, we've seen such theories as well. But knowing how Russians try to do things in a complex way, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was one of the points. So understanding who you're buying your materials from, who owns the mine or a refinery or a plant, or how do they reach your facility, what intermediaries are involved, is crucial. Moreover, this actually works the other way around too. So understanding who your buyer is, or even more importantly, who your end user is critical. This also works within the investment industry. I mean, not the industry in general, but in terms of investment processes. You want to know who's investing into your company, and sometimes, as we see it in some of our projects, it's crucial to understand who you're co-investing with, who your co-investors into a project are. Since we're dealing a lot with defense-related technology and dual-use technology projects, critical minerals are also an aspect to this, and we can see a lot of so-called corrosive investments where the actual aim of the investment isn't developing the business, but actually harming it. So the factor that has increased attention to the aspect of supply chain transparency lately is sanctions. We've all heard about sanctions, and we've seen many Russian metal plants, mines, refineries, owners being sanctioned due to their support of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And many of them tried escaping the sanctions seal by pretending not to own this or that entity and hide their ultimate beneficial ownership, basically. And of course, responsible businesses want to be sure that they're not dealing with a sanctioned entity whose real owner benefits from the brutal war launched by its country against a European nation. And one might ask, so how they actually benefit from it? Well, we'll see this further. I'll cover this slightly later. This will be very clearly seen in a bit. While conducting checks on the supply chains on your suppliers or your buyers, companies resort to automated checks, resort to databases and tools that can quicken the process, but they often lack depth. which is very well known to those trying to actually hide something, as well as to their lawyers. And the tools that can help you reach that depth required to identify the real owners, the nature of the deal, etc., is the enhanced due diligence, basically. So enhanced due diligence is obviously covering all the checklist points of a normal due diligence screening, such as the UBO, the related entities, government connections, PEPs within the ownership structure or management, litigation history, financial standings, all of those things. But it also involves an analytical component which provides you the context of the issue in question. It provides that very depth that I touched upon earlier. And the good thing about enhanced due diligence is that it often involves human intelligence, like basically source inquiries. And I will give you an example of a real source inquiry or a real source comment related to one of our projects. I obviously will not be naming any companies or sources or real names, but this comment gives a very good understanding of what I'm talking about. So while we were looking into the reputation and the background of a refinery involved in critical material supply, we came across this comment from one of our sources. So I'll be citing this one. Quote, "The plant continues to be in Victor's sphere of interest. There are still people from Victor's inner circle in the plant's ownership structure who essentially act as managers and shareholders. The decision to sell the plant was made after sanctions were imposed on Victor back in 2018. Victor wanted to retain control over the company, and in order to do so, he needed to withdraw from direct ownership and hide behind frontman, which he did." And here is where we can see the fact of benefiting from the war. Quote, "The first thing you need to understand is that the plant is an important part of the Russian military industry chain. Therefore, Victor retained control over the company. The country's leadership would not allow a stranger to control the plant." So obviously, these kinds of comments require verification. They require several sources to confirm the same thing, and basically they guide you into further research. And in this particular case, obviously, what you can do is, besides purely source inquiries, you might want to explore, say, the tender's history of an enterprise to understand the background of this company's cooperation, say, with the military industry of a particular country, right? I'm not going to go too deep into, the tenders, online tenders platforms being closed right now, the ones related to military and defense, or in Russia's case, offense cases. But there are methods to explore them as well. But the key thing here is to understand the real nature of the deals, understand the realities in a particular country. This also pertains to intermediaries that we can see quite often while conducting research on sanction circumvention schemes, where several layers of intermediary companies are in place to hide the actual seller or the buyer of the goods. And this is quite often seen while we're trying to disclose or reveal the buyers related to the military industry in autocratic states. And the only, well, not the only, but one of the critical aspects how you can disclose these issues or reveal them is through thorough analysis of trade data available through platforms, certain platforms, which I probably will not highlight right now. This might look like advertisement. Anyway, certain platforms that provide you with the trade data in a legal way, because there are different sources in the market, but I'm talking about the legal ones, legally obtainable. And in addition to those sources that help you analyze things, you would obviously want to resort to human sources, human intelligence, where you would want to talk to mining experts, investment experts, metallurgic, precious materials market analysts, industry journalists, former employees at certain enterprises, which usually provide quite a lot of information as well. And those working for entities related to the subject of your research. But the key point here is just not to tick the box while conducting your compliance screening or integrity due diligence procedure, but actually dive deeper, since most of the illicit financing goes due to the fact that companies, corporations, banks are not diligent enough to or not careful enough with how they approach their due diligence procedure, making it not deep enough, but rather, as I'm saying, ticking the box. I'll stop here probably, and happy to answer the questions if there are any.
Pavel, thank you very, very much. Everyone, please, round of applause for the fantastic Pavel. Fantastic. See, this is the awesome thing about this conference, is that we get to bring together so many different people that I think ordinarily you would never find this variety of people in the same session. Pavel, we've got a couple of questions that have come in for you, and then I'd like to open it up to the rest of our fantastic speakers who are still with us now. The first question actually does hark back to something that I think Ludovine was mentioning yesterday about those supply chains, those value chains getting more complex, more complicated. And you alluded to this, I think, in terms of the different intermediaries, the interdependencies, etc., with regards to those different actors. Do you think that sanctions and their impact on mineral value chains are getting, well, I guess there's more breadth and depth with regards to those sanctions, but do you think that we're getting the awareness from downstream actors in the way that we need in all of this?
Well, yes, the players involved in the industry are aware of this issue and they're impacted. The question is whether they want to make things diligently. The question is whether they care. So the sanctions imposed on certain market players are mostly imposed by the so-called sanctions coalition, and countries outside the sanctions coalition and companies from those countries very often don't really care unless, secondary sanctions mechanisms take place. And this happens more and more often. So we can see that jurisdictions where the countries that were quite heavily involved in sanction circumvention mechanisms, by countries I mean entities located in those countries, not the governments in general. Those countries involved in those mechanisms, say a year ago, even 6 months ago, have now significantly decreased their so to say involvement in these processes, and this is mostly due to political issues and obviously understanding their dependency on the global markets, and no one wants to lose their strong, capable Western markets for 1 or 2 billion a year, right? so it's a significant issue, but actors are being aware of that, and they're being impacted heavily. So the situation is changing, is changing, and the sanctioned entities, sanctioned individuals, are trying to find more and more evasion or circumvention schemes to obviously keep on doing their dirty business. So it's a non-stop process. But the good thing is that this actually the sanctions regimes really do make the war for the Russians, for example, in this particular case, much more expensive than it would be without them.
Thank you for that, Pavel. Now, I know that Michael has put a question into the chat. Michael, if you're still here, would you like to turn on your video and your microphone and ask your question yourself?
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Pavlo, for your presentation. My question really was looking at small and medium-sized enterprises who face the same kind of risks of being entangled in sanctions, dealing with companies with sanctions, but may not have the budget. Enhanced due diligence, and I have a background. That's in my background as well. I worked for control risks for a while in a previous lifetime. Small and medium-sized enterprises may not have the budget for enhanced due diligence, which can cost tens of thousands, if not more, dollars. So, what measures can they take to help manage these risks?
Well, Michael, thank you very much for the question. And as a regional, due diligence player, I don't want to make any kind of advertisement here, but the question makes me do this in a sense because the budgets for these kinds of procedures could be much lower than we can see in the global market. So there are players capable of providing in-depth information and answer your very specific questions in regard to the transparency of your counterparties for a much smaller budget. Moreover, smaller companies usually don't have as many third parties as large corporations. So the scale also plays an important role here. So it is also the scale of or the number of entities you need to check. Basically, you would never have all your third parties of a high risk, right? So you would have, say, 100 counterparties, 10 of which would be moderate or high risk, and you would apply enhanced due diligence only to those 10 or even 5 at times. Moreover, the country risk is also important. So whenever you can see an entity or a third party related to a certain high-risk jurisdiction, and that is another topic, how you identify the high risk of a jurisdiction, right? Well, basically, if it's from Russia or say China or Iran, obviously, but you might not even want to deal with a country like that, for example, in some cases. But you would be cautious of your direct third party, which can be an intermediary to those guys, being related to them, right? And this is where you would want to understand the high risk jurisdiction rate of a country like, for example, Turkey or the UAE or Kazakhstan that were involved previously in sanction circumvention mechanisms. So whenever you see a high risk country, you might want to apply enhanced due diligence. So it doesn't happen all the time with all your third parties, and spending, up to $20,000 a year for several checks like that would be, I believe, sufficient.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Michael, and thank you very much, Pavel, as well. I guess one of the takeaways from this, and again, this is coming through from chat behind the scenes, is that when we're talking about things that people want to avoid, of course, you mentioned that there's the human rights side, there's the environmental side, but then of course there's the sanctions side, and we all get very worried about sanctions because there's a big stick, I suspect, there. But sometimes we kind of go, well, it's okay, it doesn't matter if I hurt some people or the environment, because that might just result in a smaller penalty. Is that fair to say, or do you think the chat is going off in a strange direction?
I wouldn't narrow everything to fines, penalties, etc. And when I'm saying sanctions, the critical thing is that they are imposed for a reason. So they are imposed for supporting the aggression, for example, in Russia's case, right? So one country attacked another, and as the sanctions coalition imposed sanctions against the aggressor. It's not the penalty, it's the understanding that the critical resources that you might be selling to a country would appear in a missile that would hit a hospital, a residential area, a park, like today in the morning in Kharkiv, with 2 people murdered at once, and obviously 2 civilians. So it's the understanding of the substance of this issue, not the consequences, like the penalty or a fine. We can see plenty of cases around the world where fines are paid by the same companies time after time for money laundering violations, for example. We can see financial institutions being involved all the time. And they stay in the market for decades, and I'm more than sure they will stay there forever, because forever, never say ever. So they will stay there for a long time because they're important for the system, right? So it's not that, it's not the fine, it's the human values. I think so.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Pavel. Round of applause for Pavel, everyone. Brilliant. Excellent. So now what we're going to do is just to finish up today's session. As you can see, we've got lots of our lovely speakers who are still with us, which is great. And what I'd like to do is just to do a lap around the room. And don't worry, you don't all need to say something about sanctions. It's quite all right. Things got a little bit very well, I mean, of course, very serious there in the last talk. But what I'd like you to do is to have a think about, okay, if you could pick one choice or one decision that somebody with regards to raw materials has to make at some point in time or could make, what do you think would be the most impactful choice that somebody could make? Yes, this is me attempting to get us back to the title of this year's conference, which is, of course, Critical Choices. So what is a choice that you think somebody could or should make that would make a really, really large difference or impact in the world of raw materials? Now, I'm looking at Michael and Mark, and I'm wondering if one of you guys wants to go first. Michael's reaching for his unmute button. Michael, do you want to go first? And then we'll go to Mark. And after that, I'm then going to come across to Ellie. So on you go, Michael.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first because I think I'm going to have to drop off in about 5 minutes. Sorry about that. But, so I think from the perspective of somebody buying raw materials, raw minerals, I would say the most impactful choice is the company you are buying from. And I say this company rather than country. And I say this as somebody who has a background in political risk and country risk. But I think the company, because I think a company that acts responsibly, has all the right processes and systems and governance in place, will in turn hopefully make the right choices about some of the other things that impact on responsible and sustainable mining. So I think it's the company is critical.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. So Michael is saying the company with whom you do business. Fantastic. Mark, what do you reckon? And then we will go to Ellie. And Ellie, you don't need to say something about the business side. You can talk about haul trucks. It's all good. Mark, what about yourself? And then we'll go to Ellie.
Back to commodity trading. I mentioned that this is the big black box that so few people know about and so little is in the public domain, but it's where the most critical transactions take place. The movement of these commodities across vast distances by a very small number of companies. And they have a very, very good tracking and intelligence system which monitors shipments across the oceans or to the ports and then across the oceans to eventual delivery, containing information about volumes, contents of those. If that was put in the public domain as a global public good, I think that'd be a phenomenal advance. We can't get access to it because it's just too expensive. But it could easily put in the public domain and make an enormous difference to throw in light on what exactly is being transported, where and by whom.
And Mark, in terms of saying we can't get access to it because it's too expensive, how expensive are we talking? Do we know? And if we all club together, could we have something?
Yeah, we thought of that one too, about clubbing together. I think it was, when I looked at it 5 years ago, in the order of £50,000 a year. So not beyond the reaches of perhaps your own organisation, but I think there are limits on then sharing it as a public good. So yeah, have a look at it.
Yeah, well, I think seeing as Responsible Raw Materials is a volunteer organisation, we certainly don't have the cash, but we'd be delighted to get involved if anybody else wants some partners in this endeavour. Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for that, Mark. Ellie, what do you reckon? And then I'm going to go to Kaisi.
I'm actually going to take it not from a sort of mining point of view, but as just a regular human person, you know, living in the world and in the UK, and I just think that understanding, and it goes back to, you know, the whole education of where things come from, but actually knowing, and I realize we're also a long way from it, you know. In fact, I think back to the first Responsible Raw Materials conference, and there was a talk about sort of fingerprinting fish and metals and identifying the source of a variety of different, you know, commodities, etc. And I think if that information was available more widely, then people might just generally have a better understanding of you know, where things come from. And going back to Pavlo's point on the values is, you know, when you understand a bit more, you can probably make those better decisions for yourself and you know, stick to your own values.
Great. Thank you very, very much for that, Ellie. Fantastic. Kaisi, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Catherine.
From my side, I think there are two issues. The one is the use of technology. I think there's lots of opportunity in terms of infrastructure such as blockchain or artificial intelligence in supporting small-scale miners, creating transparency between end-to-end supply chain. You know where the material is coming from, you know your buyer, the information is shared across all parties because there are lots of players in this market. That's one. I think second is the geopolitical risks. I mean, things are changing. Risks are emerging every day. And so there's a lot of tension between different forces along the world. So, but I think at the end of the day, we pick winners, we pick losers. So we need to minimize the risk, because who becomes a winner, who becomes a loser in the entire ecosystem of trade. I think those are my two issues. Thank you.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, being cognizant of winners and losers depending on which way it's being played. Thank you very much, Kaisi. Fantastic. Kate, how about yourself? And then I'm going to bring in Matt, who has been very quiet during this session, but he has been busy typing away in the chat, etc., behind the scenes. So, Kate, what about yourself?
So I had two thoughts, but they both kind of stem from recognizing the true value of raw materials as natural capital, those mineral abiotic resources, recognizing them as part of our environment. And so for me, as an individual consumer, I think the most powerful thing I could do as an individual member of society at large is consume less. That's the first key thing. And then the second thing is, as an individual who works in and amongst the raw materials sector, to try and relay those messages of the value of abiotic natural capital to policymakers. That's a really, really key thing. How do we actually communicate the vulnerabilities that global society has at large through failing to recognize or appreciate whole systems from a raw materials perspective?
Great. Thank you very much for that, Kate. Fantastic. Matt, how about yourself? And then I'll bring in Aileen.
So the question you've asked is, what's the biggest decision
biggest choice
that we could miss?
or a choice that somebody could make that would have a big impact with regards to raw materials?
I think one of the, a lot of this always comes back to money. It's a consistent thing we keep saying, who's going to give you the money? So one of the things for me is it's not just about giving the cash, it's the return on investment. And as soon as you really change those parameters, it completely changes the scale of the decisions you're allowed to make. So whether that's your traders wanting a quick win on certain geopolitical movements or sanctions and things like that, whether it's all the way through to what Kate was talking about, those smaller mining operations where the potential return on investment could be quite quick there, but could also be part of a bigger, more broader value kind of proposition. But the other point I wanted to pick up on, which I thought was really good from Kate, and it's one that's kind of keeps bubbling along in the background, is this word value that I've heard people mention and refer to in various different ways, whether that's just value of the mineral in the ground, whether that's value of money, whether that's social value, environmental value. I think that's something that over the course of this week, hopefully we'll get more clarity on. So yeah, lots of choices.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Aileen, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Sophia.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I think coming at it, you can come at it from so many different perspectives. And I think that's something we've heard over the last 2 days. It's like everything is a different meaning to someone. And I think we've heard a lot today, especially in the last couple of talks, about ensuring responsible change. And I think a big question about that we need to kind of approach is, what does that actually mean? It's like this is different for everyone. What does responsible sourcing of materials actually mean for one person? Because in European countries, it's going to, in the conversations I've had, it's mostly about trying to avoid illegal mining, which is often just ASM or artisanal scale mining, or that's the perception, not that that's actually the case. So we're pushing our ethical views on external countries, and we think we really need to look at that. I don't think we know the answer about how to address those kind of issues, but I think for myself, around a specific choice, I think we all need to kind of step outside of our comfort zone and start to learn about these other elements, because geology and geosciences and economic geology, it's so connected to the society around us. It's so linked with the people that we engage with, but we actually need to communicate with them and figure out how to communicate with them. So I think trying to bring in everyone to the conversation through events like this is a really good step. Yeah.
Thanks, Aileen. And finally, Sophia, and then we're going to do one final lap of the room just for final thoughts. And I'm going to go to Mark first, because I know his laptop's about to die. So we are running that race. Sophia, let's come to yourself first.
Thanks, Sarah. I was actually going to steal Kate's one about consuming less, but I think more than consuming less, I'm kind of new to the industry of mining. I'm on a social impact leadership program at the moment. And so this is sort of my first month into the mining industry, and I spend a lot of time with people who care about sustainability and social impact. And I think maybe the next choice is about education or just informing people. I think before the last month, it's sort of in the term raw materials, you forget that everything comes from these raw materials, and it's so easy to see mining as a boogeyman and something that we are just blankly against, but recognizing that we also use it every day. So I think there's something around that education and informing people about, so you can buy less, but you're making some really intentional purchases because you kind of recognize where things have come from.
Love it. Thank you very much, Sophia. Awesome. And I'm loving the fact that you are with us this week as well, because as someone, as you just said, who's not from a raw materials background, although of course surrounded by them, it's really interesting, kind of hearing and being involved in your commentary actually on all of this as well, which is fantastic. So thank you. Okay, so last stream around the room. Mark, final words of wisdom, comments, ideas, and then we're going to go to Kaisi.
Well, I was looking at Ellie's first slide of what an ideal mine should look like, and I thought, wow, that's such a long way from most people's reality of a mine, and certainly far removed from most mine sites I've ever seen in the global south. So there's a very, very long way to go in that regard. But it certainly made me think about how our communities consulted, not just about the benefits that should accrue to them from mining in their backyard in terms of jobs and better services and housing and roads and other infrastructure, but also to be consulted on how not just the environment is respected, but in terms of how the landscape is evolving, and that they have a say over what it looks like. So thank you for your opening slide, Ellie. Very inspirational.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great. Kaisi, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Ellie.
I think my thoughts are two. One is, I think, how do we use mining to unlock structure transformation? That's what really makes my head ponder, because in my country, in 1990s, we used to export a lot of coffee, cotton, tea. That was large chunk of our export basket, agriculture commodities. Now things have changed. 50% of it is just gold, copper, natural resources. But we are not really seeing, it's just extraction. There's no bit of manufacturing or value-added high-tech type of employment. So when you run out of resources, where do you get the room to grow? So I think for policymakers, traders, there's a big issue to ponder. Once the resources are out, what comes next? So I think for developing countries, there's really issue to unlock. How do you link your natural resources to unlock your structure transformation of your economy? I think that will remain one of the biggest challenge for the next decades. Thank you.
Love it. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kaisi. Ellie, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Pavel.
So I guess, and it was sort of, while going through and generating the presentation sort of with the rest of the team, it really to us sort of came back to the early stage. You really need to be thinking about all these risks and the potential risks that you may encounter down the line, and actually finding the opportunity in those to try and mitigate against them. And I keep harping on about, because Richard's was such a great segue from the closure, but it's so critical to be thinking about that early on and really putting the sort of time and resources into working out what you're going to do at the end, because that's where everyone wants to get to. They want a successful mining operation to make money and then to close and restore it to what it was. That's the end goal for all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Ellie. Pavel, how about yourself? And then we'll finish off with Kate.
Right. Well, I could have said a lot about, given the perspective of my professional expertise, I could say a lot about adopting a robust enhanced due diligence, system, etc. However, since I'm one of the last here to speak, I need to be philosophical. So what I would say is that whenever you make decisions in whatever industry you work in, and whenever you make a choice, as a father to a little lovely lady, I should probably say that we should think of the little kids around the world. Don't think I'm trivial here, but I really do think that's important, because they are the victims of the sins of the grown-ups. So I would think that is crucial to keep in mind while doing important work on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much, Pavel. And then finally, Kate, final words from yourself.
Yes, I thought, my talk was about the local and the global, and I've commented how we should be reducing consumption individually, and the sort of knock-on consequences of that is, where are the growth markets going to be at the same time that we are trying to develop regional European resources. And down here in Cornwall, retention of mineral wealth is much a concern here, as Kaisi just described for Tanzania. So where producer regions are exporting raw materials at low cost, it fails to add value regionally to economic development. And that we're seeing that coming closer to home. It's very much a concern down here. So if you compare the fact that consumer nations have been traditionally focusing on retaining the highest value end manufacturing parts of the supply chain, and we're now moving upstream, then African nations with the African Mining Vision are thinking more about moving downstream in the markets. And with the carbon footprints overprinting all of that, you know, that there is a re-equilibration coming down the line, regardless of what people's political positioning would be. I think that's almost inevitable as economies reshape. So that's quite interesting. And I think it's part of a bigger picture that we see here locally as well, is who has access to land, who has access to mineral rights, and who derives benefit. And as we see that there is increasing conflict, and Richard mentioned a couple of case studies down here as well, one where things haven't been done quite so well. If we don't get it right, the mining doesn't go ahead. And who derives wealth and who has access to land and mineral rights is really, really wrapped up in that. And that's quite a tricky thing to unpick. So I think lots of reshaping within nation and internationally on some of these issues is going to be quite a significant rebalancing as climate change does bite. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for today's afternoon session. So session number 3 of this year's Responsible Raw Materials Conference. Firstly, let's give them a round of applause, because I think you've all been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much for that. For those attendees who are still with us, I know that it is the end of a long day of lots and lots of ideas, and I can feel them all shaking around in my head and thinking, well, hang on a second, how does this all fit together? What does that plan moving forwards really look like? Well, don't worry, because if you haven't quite formed that aha, kind of this is where we need to go plan, we've got another 2 sessions for you tomorrow. So at 8 a.m. UK time, we'll be starting session 4, and that features a number of fantastic Australians bringing awesome bits and pieces of kit to the table. Not literally, I don't think they'll be bringing them in front of their computer screens, but we're going to be speaking to Caroline Tiddy, first of all, talking about the development of new drilling technologies, and then we're going to be speaking to a range of other individuals as well, talking about similar aspects, which is going to be great. We then are going to welcome, for example, Dave Laurie and James Cleverly from IMDEX, who are going to be talking about what we want and need can't all happen at the same time. There we go. We have been told. Dial in to find out what they actually mean by that. We've then got our Bursting the Bubble panel session, which is going to feature the wonderful Sophia, who of course has been cheating because she's been filling her head with lots of information on raw materials, but this is all good. And so we're going to hear from a number of very courageous individuals who will be sharing their thoughts with regards to that. And then in the second session of Wednesday, which will start at 3 o'clock UK time, this is where we've got another fantastic lineup for you. So we've got Sarah Binger from Resonance, we've got Susanna Fitzgerald from Resource Governance, we've got Murray Hitzman, we've got Carolina Sanchez, we've got Kyle Pierce, you name it. We've got individuals who are going to bring fantastic discussions to the table. All of our talks from sessions 1 and 2 are already up and online, so please do go and take a look at all of those. If you've got questions, comments, ideas, or you think that your perspective hasn't been represented by somebody who's already speaking, get in touch and we will try and roll that into this week's proceedings. The purpose of Responsible Raw Materials is to bring together as many different perspectives, ideas, solutions as we possibly can, so we can put them all into the pot, shake them around and hope that something useful might fall out, and that might be one of the mechanisms through which we can help the sector move forwards in a very, very constructive manner. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. We will see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. UK time, and a final round of applause for our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much.